If you like the story, you can support the author on Patreon, link is in the description.
Chapter 71, Tender is the Night 3. Whoosh, asterisk. The rain continued pouring down, gaining more momentum as time passed. It seemed as if a torrential storm was passing by outside. As for the café, it had already closed its doors and pulled down the blinders. Now, no one can see anything that would transpire inside. Hugging Furina tightly, Isaac spent a good amount of time giving her a deep passionate kiss, never parting from her pristine lush lips. During this time, he savored her as much as he could. Currently, he was lying down on one of the long couches of the café, holding Furina tightly above him and pressing her against his body. The feeling of another person's heat being shared with him, coupled with the enthralling sensation of receiving her affection, gave Isaac a run for his sanity. He had to admit, it was an otherworldly feeling. Such sensations were foreign to him. But with this, he couldn't go back now. He had already overstepped his boundaries and he knew his actions would have a significant impact on fate. However, whether it was good or bad changes, right now, Isaac cared little for that. All his focus right now was on the person he was holding in his arms. After what seemed like a long time, the two's lips finally parted, and what ensued were deep paintings that crossed each of their boundaries. Isaac, who still felt his head throb and an insurmountable amount of fatigue, looked at Furina with his deep amber eyes hazily. As for the latter, amidst an enrapture, her face was beet red as she looked back at him with captivating hypnotic eyes. Ha! Ha! A moment of silence descended upon them as they looked at each other. You really went and did it. Furina was the first to break the silence. You just violated your god. How blasphemous of you! Such an unpardonable crime. Worthy of an appropriate punishment. Forgive me. Still looking at her with tired eyes, Isaac smiled faintly. I just couldn't resist. Well, since I'm already a criminal, then. As Isaac uttered this, he leaned his head forward, and, with a light smirk, he continued. Excuse me. After saying this, Isaac dug his face beneath her face and, gently, gave her strong pecks of kisses on her neck. Ah! That! Surprised by Isaac's sudden actions, Furina subconsciously brought her hand closer to her mouth and bit it. Ha! No! Wait! However, despite her protests, Isaac didn't stop and cherished each moment of exploring her. More than anything, her resistance just made Isaac more infatuated with her. HNNGH. Ha! Yut. Muffling her voice with her hand, Furina tried her best to not let out any indecent sounds. However, it was to no avail as it just made Isaac even more motivated. Isaac's kisses were long and passionate, leaving behind faint red marks on her neck. It was as if he was marking her. You idiot! Looking down on Isaac, who was sucking her neck like a mosquito, Furina complained. Those are gonna be hard to hide. Is that so? Looking back at her, Isaac smirked faintly. Then, you better hide these well. After saying this, Isaac leaned more towards her neckbone, and, out of nowhere, he gently bit her. Heek! Baffled by the sudden bite, Furina squealed. She then looked at Isaac with a troubled look. Why did you do that? Isaac looked back at her, and, with a weak sly voice, he answered. A mark. A mark. Upon hearing this, Furina complained harder. Her eyes looked as if they were on the verge of crying. I'm not an animal. I know, Isaac replied. His faint soft smile reassured her. However, with this, you're now mine. Upon hearing his remark, Furina became silent for a few moments. Not long after, however, she lowered her head, and, similar to Isaac, she bit into his collarbone. Aha! Isaac didn't mind it one bit and let her bite him. Consider this as fair revenge. She then uttered after leaving her mark on him. I'll honor it. Isaac nodded his head sincerely. Thank you. Idiot. Tired of Isaac's games, Furina leaned more and hugged his head, bringing it closer to her. Enough with that. We're civilized people, not animals, so. Yes, I get it. Isaac followed along with her train of thought. With that said, the two once more linked their lips. Feeling Isaac's soft delicate lips, something she didn't know a man could have, Furina cherished this session once more. She always thought that a kiss would be a transient feeling, something that lovers would only do to express their commitment. However, she now takes back her words. It was completely different from what she thought it was. It was more than showing love. Each moment when she was kissing Isaac felt like a long time as time had stopped. At the same time, a strange euphoric feeling crept up her spine as time went on. Indeed, it was different. Such a sensation wasn't something she would have ever known if not for him. In the dull black and white world she always lived in, something like this was something she thought was impossible. Just a bit more. Furina thought as she took in the moment, immersing herself in it. Show me more of this foreign feeling. Just then, while Furina was enjoying her moment with Isaac, he suddenly parted with her. Hey! Why, did you stop? Confused why Isaac suddenly stopped, she asked while panting heavily. Isaac, on the other hand, was also panting heavily. He then spoke, I'm sorry. It's just my headache, it's... He then caressed his temples. I'm sorry. That... Remembering Isaac's current condition, Furina suddenly came back to her rational thought. Are you all right? This is my fault, I shouldn't have. No, it's not. Really? Isaac assured her as he shook his head. He then continued. I just need to rest. However, his deep amber eyes then locked onto Furina, and, with a hesitant voice, he continued. I want to be in my room. A moment of silence soon followed. Furina was no fool, she immediately understood the underlying meanings behind that sentence. And, upon realization, she paused momentarily. If you think that this is enough. Isaac was just about to offer her to stop now and leave, when all of a sudden, Furina interrupted him. You just need to be in your room to rest, right? With a meek voice, she hid her mouth with her palm. Very well then. I'll accompany you. I'll stay here for the night. That's... Surprised by her decision, Isaac became stupefied. Wait. Does that mean? Just don't. Furina then lowered her hand and looked at Isaac. Let's just don't do that yet. All right. Upon hearing this, a small smile couldn't help but form on Isaac's face. All right. I promise. Good. Furina nodded her head. Then, with all the strength Isaac could muster, he stood up and walked up the stairs to his room. Assisting him was Furina. During the moment on their way to his room, Furina's heart kept pounding hard as if it was about to burst out from her chest. She shuddered at the thought of what Isaac might do to her. But since he promised, she chose to believe him. I know he'd keep his promise. But... Furina shook her head before any scenes could even form. No. Let's not think about that right now. It would be a lie if Furina said she wasn't expecting it, but still she still had a role and dignity to uphold as the god of justice. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they finally arrived outside Isaac's room. Please, make yourself at home, Isaac said before opening the door. Shortly afterward, he entered. Furina, who followed him, looked around his room. It was then that she remembered something. Now that I think about it, this isn't the first time I've been here. There was that time when we got drunk and as Furina thought to herself, her eyes wandered over to Isaac, and, upon seeing what he was doing, she stopped mid-sentence. Hey! On his bed, Isaac was unbuttoning his waistcoat and dress shirt, ignoring Furina. That's... Seeing Isaac undress, Furina almost wanted to run out of the door. However, for whatever reason, her legs stayed still and watched him. He will uphold his promise. Right. Just then, Isaac caught her stare, and a second later, he smirked. Extending his hand, he reached out for her. He didn't say a word and merely looked at her with his warm hazy eyes. Furina, who looked at him, hesitated for a moment before reaching out her hand and holding him. Don't worry. Isaac, now holding Furina, pulled her over. I will keep my oath. Whoa. Furina staggered when she was pulled by Isaac, which subsequently resulted in her falling on top of his body. You fool! Suddenly pulling me like that. How inconsiderate of you. Haha, sorry. Chuckling softly, Isaac amused her. His warm eyes then looked at her directly in the eyes. Well then. Geez. Furina understood what he meant. She then pressed herself against him and held his face. You better be fully healed by tomorrow. Don't worry. With you here, I'm sure, that won't be a problem. You and your sly tongue. Extending his arms over her body, Isaac hugged her tightly close to his body, feeling her innate heat. Furina, on the other hand, held his face and resumed their previous session, sinking deep in each other's melting pleasure. Tender was the night which sheltered secrets. Chapter 72, Her Happiness. Slowly, the streets of Fontaine, which were drenched with the rain that came prior, began to show signs of life once more. It was still dark out, but there were already many people walking in the streets holding umbrellas, each going on about their everyday lives. On one inconspicuous area of Vizari Passage, one café that didn't stand out was present. Its minimalistic and simple yet elegant look was perhaps the only thing that made it look interesting. Its window blinds were still closed, and the closed sign hung at the door. In this simple café, no one would have expected their Archon to spend the night with another person. Isaac, who was lying down on his head, slowly opened his eyes due to the singing of the birds outside. The pain's gone. Relieved that the adverse effects were finally over, Isaac let out a small sigh of relief. Thank goodness. It felt like a migraine headache but tenfold. I don't want to experience that again. Just then, Isaac felt weak movements near him. Shifting his gaze, he noticed a certain someone lying down next to him, curling herself near his chest and hugging him. Seeing this person, Isaac became silent for a few moments before letting out a small smile. Right. Looking at Furina's unconscious face, an unfamiliar feeling swept past Isaac. He felt that it was an innate sense of happiness, but it was much more intense and gentler than that. His deep amber eyes then became soft, cherishing the scene in front of him. Having remembered every moment that happened last night, he couldn't help but recall every sensation he felt. Her tender warmth, paired with the growing heat of the moment, only made each second of it more and more tempting to go beyond what they planned. However, he kept his promise and refrained from going too far. In the end, after a long session of deep kisses across each other's bodies, and occasional bites, the two of them finally got tired and decided to sleep. Who would have ever thought that someone like me would have the chance to see such a sight? Isaac lampooned self-deprecatingly. And with the nation's Archon herself, nonetheless. It was something completely out of his expectations. However, it was a welcomed surprise. Lifting his hand, Isaac brought his hand over to Furina's head and caressed her greyish-white hair, before taking them off her face for him to see. Seeing Furina's sleeping face, a faint red tinge spread across Isaac's face for a moment as a wide warm smile formed. He then quickly composed himself, but he could still feel his face's warm temperature. She really was dangerous. Isaac closed his eyes for a moment, trying to cover his blush. To make me this vulnerable. MNGH. Just then, a soft grumble escaped Furina's mouth. It seemed like she was having a dream. She then buried her face deeper into Isaac's chest. MMPH. Having caught notice of this, Isaac felt amused and played around with her hair a bit longer. He then whispered under his breath, "What could you be dreaming about?" Just then, another sound escaped Furina's mouth. Although her face was still buried in Isaac's chest, the sound still crept out. "Isaac, help me, with the tea." It was a series of weak grumblings, but Isaac, through patience, managed to connect them all together. When he deciphered what Furina was grumbling about, a wry smile appeared on his face. Dreaming about tea, hey. He then remembered how she would often ask him to brew tea for her almost every moment during his time as her assistant. She even tried learning how to brew herself, but no matter how much she did it, her brewed tea or coffee never reached the level of Isaac's brews. That reminds me. Looking at the clock on the wall, Isaac muttered to himself. Should I brew up my morning tea? Isaac always starts his day with caffeinated tea. Yeah, I should also prepare one for Furina. After saying this, Isaac was just about to get out of bed, when suddenly, Furina's hug became tighter. Furina. Noticing this, Isaac turned his head and looked back at her. However, all he saw was her sleeping face. Don't leave. Please. Furina grumbled under her breath. She appeared to still be asleep and was having a nightmare. I don't want to be alone. Heek. At some point, her weak voice began to falter and was slowly descending to pitiful pleas. It was almost as if she was on the verge of crying. Watching her, Isaac's eyes couldn't help but soften. He then caressed his temples. Right. How could I forget? The one thing Furina hates and fears the most is. Remembering the looming prophecy over Fontaine, Isaac clenched his teeth. Is being left alone. On the surface, Furina appeared stable and normal, displaying her flamboyant personality. However, beneath her false bravado lies a much more broken and weak person who doesn't want her nation to be destroyed, leaving her all alone. Remembering all of these, Isaac shut his eyes for a moment before returning to bed. Lying down next to her, he brought over the blankets and placed them on top of the two of them. Since it was still cold outside, he thought that Furina might catch a cold. After doing this, he hugged her again and held her next to him. He then brought his face close to her and whispered softly, "Don't worry. I'll be here for you, always." With that said, Isaac leaned his face closer and kissed her forehead for a moment before parting. After that, he hugged her tightly and shared his warmth with her. "I want you to be happier." With that in mind, while holding Furina close, Isaac slowly drifted back to sleep. As for Furina, she was still now smiling softly, as if the nightmare she had before disappeared. In the warmth of Isaac, she slept peacefully. And so, with the constant rain still happening outside providing adequate cold for the two, they slept once more. Humming to herself, Furina, who was wearing an apron, brewed a set of tea with ease. She was wearing a simple dress shirt and black slacks. Over it was a black apron. The tea was diverse in flavor, each having its own unique taste and origin. And, all of them were prepared by Furina. With a smile on her face, she carefully placed the tea on a table before taking one for herself. Hoo! Hoo! Blowing over the teacup, Furina cooled it off for a moment before taking a sip. Feeling the warm sweet taste with a faint bitter aftertaste, Furina smiled at her success. "Tastes good." "Oh? Really?" Just then, a deep voice came from behind her. All of a sudden, an arm extended from behind her, and took her teacup. "Let me have a taste." "Hey! You could have just taken your own cup, you know." Recognizing the voice, Furina pouted. She then moved her head behind her and looked at the person that just spoke. "Isaac." "Haha, I'm sorry." The man behind her, Isaac, chuckled softly like he usually does. Similar to her, he wore a white dress shirt with black slacks. Over it was an olive waistcoat and an apron. His deep amber eyes, which were quite striking and prominent, warmly looked at Furina. "Still, that does taste good. You did a good job, Furina." Of course. After all, it was me who made it." Furina boasted confidentially, full of pride over her work. "It only took a short time for me to get a hang of this." Yet, smiling full of amusement, Isaac chuckled. "Well, you'd have to make it a bit better to catch up to me." "Humph. Just wait, I'll be there soon." Furina glanced at him and declared. "I know." Isaac's warm eyes looked at her before nodding his head. He then smiled softly. "If it's you, it won't take long." After saying this, while standing behind her, Isaac leaned his head forward from her shoulders and closed his eyes. "Geez." Seeing this, a red tinge spread across Furina's face. She then closed her eyes too and accepted Isaac. Chew asterisk. What ensued was a sweet kiss between the two, similar to a couple. After a short moment, the two of them parted. Isaac was the first to speak after the kiss. He then smiled softly. "I love you." Saying something like that out of the blue. Hearing this, even Furina's ears turned a red hue. With a meek voice, she replied. Me too." Her heterochromatic eyes then looked away and back to the teacups. She then immediately changed the subject. Anyway. Shouldn't you tend to the counter now? There might be new customers." "All right, I'll be there soon." Isaac nodded his head lightly and replied. However, before he went back, he looked back at her. "By the way, after this shift, wanna go on a dinner date?" "Hey?" All of a sudden, turning her head, Furina looked at Isaac with surprised eyes. "What's the occasion?" "Nothing." He smiled. "Just want to treat you." "All right. Keep your word." "I will." It was a dream. Furina knew it too well. However, unlike her usual dreams, this one was different. For the longest time, she had only just been dreaming about an empty stage, with only her as the actor. But, strangely enough, today's dream was different. Because another actor was present. Although Furina was surprised by this sudden change in her dreamscape, strangely enough, she didn't dislike it. In this silent sanctuary of Isaac's Café, she felt an odd sense of serenity. And to her, that was enough reason to accept this new dream. For it is the only change that occurred after her long arduous journey. However, unbeknownst to Furina, a spectator was present in her dreamscape. And that spectator that greatly resembled her appearance watched her act with Isaac without uttering a word. Chapter 73, Shameless Fool. Chirp asterisk. As the soft singing of the birds was heard outside, the tender light of the morning sun slowly crept in from the window. You. Groggily opening her eyes, Furina slowly started to wake up. With her eyes half open, she yawned. Han. In the bed, she raised her hand and rubbed her eye sockets with it, cleaning them in the process. Awake. Just then, a laid-back voice reached Furina's ears, and, like a cat, she immediately got startled. Wah. She then immediately looked behind her and saw Isaac lying down on his sides, watching her while supporting his head with his arm. With a sly smirk on his face, Isaac chuckled lightly. He then greeted her with a soft vibrant expression. Good morning. Isaac. Why? Surprised by Isaac's nonchalant expression and laid-back attitude, Furina was just about to ask what was happening, when suddenly, she got hit by a massive sense of déjà vu. Hold on. She then remembered the first time she slept at Isaac's place. She also forgot she slept here at that time. Baffled by this, Furina's expression froze. I need to fix that bad habit of mine. On the other hand, her heterochromatic blue eyes then looked at Isaac. Furina, who was stupefied earlier, began to remember everything that transpired last night. Having thought of this, she immediately looked beneath the blanket she and Isaac shared. It's still there. Seeing that she still had her clothes on, she let out a small sigh of relief. So he did keep his promise. I might be a lot of things, but I keep my promises. Just then, as if he had read her mind, Isaac smiled wryly. So it would seem. Looking back at Isaac, Furina nodded her head as she tried to hide her embarrassment. This was, after all, her first time sharing a bed with a man. Thank you. And. While sitting up on the bed, Furina couldn't help but look at Isaac. Although Isaac had a white blanket over his body, she could clearly see his outlined body, meaning only one thing: he was shirtless. Having caught notice of this, a red hue couldn't help but spread across her face. She then quickly tried to change the subject. Do you want to have breakfast? Seeing her suddenly change the subject, a sly smile formed on Isaac's face as he hummed. Sure. After saying this, Isaac suddenly took off his blanket and stood out of the bed. Just as Furina expected, he was shirtless. Wah. At least put on a shirt. Seeing this, Furina quickly placed her hands over her eyes. Fool. PFT, sure. Amused by her reaction, Isaac took it to heart and went to find a new dress shirt. After what we did last night? You're still embarrassed by this? Okawi koto. Shut up. Shameless fool. Furina then threw a pillow at him, all the while trying to hide her flustered expression. However, although Furina was surprised by Isaac's boldness, she couldn't help but be curious. In the end, she slightly opened her eyes to take a peek. Hey! It was then when she saw it. Looking at Isaac's bare body, she couldn't help but notice a few things. Scars? From Isaac's lower back to his waist, and to his upper back, faint scars were present. There weren't many, but all of them were sufficiently long and jagged. Did he get all of those when he worked for the Fontaine Research Institute? Furina was well aware of Isaac's past. As such, she knows that Isaac was one of the few people who survived the Institute's explosion. However, seeing those scars, even she found it hard to believe for someone like him to survive such fatal injuries. No. She then noticed something. Some of them are faint, while the others look like they just happened recently. Has Isaac been fighting? As this thought went through her mind, she couldn't help but remember the reason she followed him last night in the first place. That. Furina. Just then, Isaac's voice drifted over to her. Let's go down together. Looking back at Isaac, she found him to have already worn a new dress shirt. Although it was still far from his usual uniform, it was enough for today. Furina, who was in the middle of pondering, decided to set aside this train of thought for a moment. Looking at Isaac, she nodded lightly. All right. Standing up, she left the bed and followed behind Isaac down to the café. As they walked, Furina's heterochromatic blue eyes looked at his figure, seemingly lost in thought. Just what are you hiding? Over in Isaac's kitchen, he began to assemble breakfast for the two of them. In this instance, he decided to pick a light meal for them to enjoy. Picking them out directly from the system shop, he bought bread, butter, jam, cereal, yogurt, and, to top it all off, an Earl Grey tea with jasmine flowers. Looking at the breakfast in front of him, Isaac thought for a moment, as if he was trying to remember something. Ah! How could I forget? With a sudden realization, Isaac reached out to his inventory, and a moment later, 2 pairs of warm croissants popped out and onto the silver platter. We can't possibly forget the iconic bread. He hummed to himself with an amused smile. Carrying the 2 silver platters on both of his hands, he left the kitchen and approached the table. Furina was it. Looking at her, he smiled. He then placed the silver platters on the table. Your dish, my lady. You can just drop the honorifics, you know. Resting her face with her hand on the table, Furina glanced at Isaac. Weren't you so bold as to just address me by my name last night? Wherever must have that went. Oh yeah. Now that Furina mentioned it, Isaac quickly remembered what she was referring to. Having realized this, he merely shrugged. It's a habit at this point, I guess. That's the only way I spoke to you in the past, after all. Anywho. Pulling out a seat for himself, Isaac sat down at the same table as Furina. He then looked at her and smiled softly. Bon appétit. Merci, Furina replied back, nodding at Isaac's effort for their meal. She then looked at the tea and couldn't help but comment. Does this? 6 sugar cubes. Nothing more, nothing less. Spreading jam on his bread, Isaac smirked. He then also looked at her. With your sweet tooth, I made sure to pick the best suited meal. Hehe, you really are the best servant. Furina chuckled to herself as she picked up her tea and cradled it. Looking at Furina, who was sipping her tea, Isaac, who was holding onto his bread with jam on it, couldn't help but soften his eyes. In this tranquil cafe, only the two of them are present. There were no distractions, and most importantly, it was peaceful. In this silent sanctuary, Isaac couldn't help but be grateful for this safe space he had for himself and others. As he watched the steam rise from his tea, Isaac's smile softened. How beautiful would it be if every day was like this? If only. As he looked at his reflection in the tea, memories began to surge in his mind. He now has a lot of problems to take care of now that he was the de facto head of the confrérie of Cabriere. There is also the matter regarding the traveler. For now, he still doesn't know what Lumen is doing, but he hopes that everything is still sailing smoothly on her journey. Moreover, Nouvelette's worry about him still wasn't fading. There were still occasional marechaussee agents that came and went into his café. In addition, Klee, and although she didn't show it, felt like she harbored enmity towards Isaac. With all of these factors combined, Isaac even jokes that he'd get a headache similar to the Evernight skill's adverse effects without relying on the skill itself. As his thoughts fell deeper and his eyes became sharper, a tender voice suddenly dragged him back to reality. What are you thinking so hard about? It was Furina's voice, that familiar voice he always heard. Looking at Isaac with a curious gaze while eating a bowl of cereal, Furina added, just what is it that makes you look so contemplative so much? Isaac, who regained his self-awareness, looked back at Furina. He then smiled softly, I was just lost in a thought. Think not much of it. By the way. Changing the subject, Isaac quickly looked for another matter. We're nearing the end of the film, yet. You're right, Furina nodded her head as she ate her cereal. After today, we're pretty much finished. We'll just leave it to the editors. I see. That's... Isaac was just about to reply when he was suddenly greeted with something. For a fraction of a second, his eyes widened in surprise before they returned to normal. Noticing this, Furina, who was always observative, raised an eyebrow. Replaying the expression Isaac made, she began pondering. What was what? It looked as if he was reading something. Suspecting something, Furina's gaze sharpened as she opened her mouth and asked, What's wrong? Why didn't you finish your sentence? I'm fine. Just then, Isaac answered her question. Scoffing lightly, he picked up his tea and cradled it. I just merely got caught in thinking about miscellaneous stuff. Notice. The Knave takes an interest in you. Chapter 74, The Warmth of the Café 1. Are you sure you don't want me to accompany you? Looking at Furina outside the café's entrance, Isaac questioned. There's no need, Furina shook her head as she refused him. She then placed her hands on her waist and continued, besides, it's about time for the café to open, is it not? That's true. But still. Isaac wanted to persist, but before he could do so, a hand suddenly blocked his mouth. Furina, who supported herself by raising her foot to reach Isaac's height, placed her hands over his mouth. MMFH. Surprised by Furina's sudden actions, Isaac was just about to question what she was doing when he was met with a surprise. Chew asterisk. A small peck on the cheek. There. Trying to hide her flustered expression, Furina took her hand back as she backed away from Isaac. Would that work? Isaac, on the other hand, stared at her blankly for a few moments before smirking. How bold of you! He then chuckled lightly and nodded at her. All right, have a safe trip back to the palette, Furina. J. Vase. Furina replied with a light nod. And, with that, she turned around and left. However, before she disappeared, she turned around once more and waved at Isaac. As for the latter, he also waved back with his hand. Seeing her slowly disappear, Isaac sighed and closed the door of the café. What an odd turn of events! He said to himself in disbelief. I still can't believe it. In this quiet café, only his voice reverberated. As the light of the morning sun shined from the windows, Isaac stared blankly at the shadows of the chairs for a moment, his eyes, full of melancholy. At that moment, his deep amber eyes, which always looked lifeless and devoid of emotions, began to swirl with thoughts. Tud asterisk. His back then leaned on the wall before he slowly slid down to the floor. Placing his hands over his face that reached his hair, a deep audible, and heavy sigh escaped from his mouth. Ha! I've overstepped my bounds. His impulsive actions have now crossed the line. He was now at the point of no return. He couldn't undo his actions anymore. With this, he had now solidified his direct interference in fate. Him an anomaly that wasn't supposed to be here. Isaac! You idiot! Brushing back his hair with his fingers, Isaac grumbled under his breath. What happens if Furina's role is broken because of your actions? He knows far too well how his work could have seriously impacted Furina's unspoken role. For she must act as the god of justice, and being with a mere mortal could subvert that role. Her 500 years of hard work could have gone to the gutter because of a person who shouldn't have interfered. He bit his lip at this thought. Remembering her sacrifice, her willingness and tenacity to endure centuries worth of suffering made Isaac grit his teeth. All her efforts could have gone to waste because of me. Her deeply painful efforts. After this thought, Isaac fell into silence. For an unknown amount of time, he remained seated in silence on the café's floor, deep into contemplation. No. Just then, a meek voice escaped from Isaac's mouth. He then lifted his head. However, this time, something had changed. Isaac's left eye, under the darkness, looked as if it was giving off a luminescent deep amber glow. What differentiates it from his usual eyes is that it looks eerily creepy. Just looking at it makes one's skin crawl with shivers. There's still a way to mitigate this. As Isaac thought of this, a plan began to form in his mind. Yes. Making up a plan, Isaac stood up and walked to the counter. He then took out his journal. Afterward, he took out a pen and began writing. The sound of him frantically scribbling on his hook was the only sound present for a while. However, not long after, he finally formed the framework for his plan. Looking at it, Isaac's eyes stayed still for a moment, checking for any vulnerabilities. After a while, he smiled wryly at his newly formed plan. Yeah, this could work. With this, there's still a chance to get everything back on track. Just then, another thing caught his attention. Notice. A new quest has been created. SS rank quest. Type, main quest. Title, The Nameless King. Description, it was more than a title. It was an ideology. Objective. Looking at the newly formed quest issued by the system, Isaac was momentarily speechless before a faint sinister smile spread across his face. How cute of you, system. To think you'd base your new quest on my plan. Standing up, Isaac looked at his café for a moment before letting out a small sigh of relief. In that momentary silence, a small smile formed on his face. Yeah, this would work. It has to. Lady Gyuji, if you would, please just. Enough. If you don't have anything else to say, then please, leave this mountain. Meanwhile, over in Inazuma's Mt. Yugu's Grand Narukami Shrine, the highly famed head shrine maiden, Ye Miko, was overseeing a matter. However, evident by her lackluster attitude, she seems to not be enjoying the talk. But lady, the man tried to continue persuading her when she suddenly cut him off. Don't make me say it twice. With a cold and uninterested voice, she brushed him off. This is your last chance. As she said this, electro-fox silhouettes began to form behind her. Seeing the electro-foxes, the man subconsciously gulped. He had heard about the head shrine maiden's short temper, but he didn't think that it would be this short. Mission failed. Bowing his head, the man apologized. My apologies, Lady Gyuji. I'm sorry for troubling you today. Whatever, just go. Still bored out of her mind, Ye Miko sent one electro-fox after the man. Wait. Seeing this, the man's eyes widened. He then started running away while being chased away by the electro-fox. Lady Gyuji. Please. I'm sorry. With that said, the man finally left the shrine and descended the mountain. Humph, foolish errands. Frowning, Ye Miko rolled her eyes and turned around. Lady Gyuji, wasn't that too much? Just then, another shrine maiden got curious and asked. I mean, you haven't even heard what he wanted yet. I don't need to. I already know what he wanted. Turning around, with the same lackluster expression, she looked at the shrine maiden. That fool is nothing more than a dog of the Tenryu Commission trying to rope me in their self-annihilating path. A dog? And self-annihilation? Utterly confused, the shrine maiden probed further. What does that mean? It means he wanted me to be with their little conspiracy against the Raiden Shogun. She scoffed as she replied to the shrine maiden. Truly, their arrogance has reached unprecedented bounds. Against the Raiden Shogun. The shrine maiden was no fool, and she immediately understood what Ye Miko meant. Are they staging a coup d'état against the Raiden Shogun? A coup d'état? Upon hearing this, Ye Miko couldn't help but laugh lightly. Haha, I'd love to see them try. Do you really think they have the guts to face the Raiden Shogun's Muzhu no Hitotachi? Of course not, Lady Gyuji. The shrine maiden shook her head calmly. She then continued. I was just wondering where their brains went for them to even conspire against the Raiden Shogun. Well, that's true. Ye Miko nodded her head. As for your question. Well, it has something to do with a certain snowy nation. Oh. Immediately, everything clicked inside the shrine maiden's head. Fachui. Bingo. With that said, Ye Miko turned around and headed for her abode. Well, now you have the gist of it. Thank you, Lady Gyuji. Replied the shrine maiden as she bowed to her. Ye Miko hummed as she went inside her abode and closed the door. Within the confines of her privacy, she sighed. How utterly boring. Inside, she locked the door and looked around her room for a moment. She then looked at the door at a certain corner of the room. Walking over it, she sighed lightly. She then grabbed the handle of the door. Do entertain me, Isaac. It's so boring here. With that said, she opened the door. Immediately after, she felt that a certain amount of mora she had on her person had disappeared. This was the payment, after all. Afterward, Ye Miko passed through the door. In her vision, she was enveloped by a starry sea, with nothing but the boundless stars present. However, not long after, all those stars disappeared, and now, she was standing inside Isaac's cafe. Klee, don't bother Nahida too much. Her ears then perked up as she heard the familiar voice that had always brought her unfound entertainment. Standing behind the counter he usually works at, Ye Miko saw the familiar Isaac pouring a cup of coffee on a cup. Hee, it's fine. On a table not far away, the white-haired child whom Ye Miko found endearing replied. Klee is so energetic and playful, how could I pass off a chance to play? That's right, Mr. Isaac. Beside her, the child in red smiled happily. With us together, we're invincible. Nahida promised me that she'll help me improve my Jumpty Dumpties. Upon hearing this, Isaac's face suddenly became grim. Oh Archons, please no. Haha. Seeing Isaac's expression, both Nahida and Klee laughed. Seeing this warm scene, Ye Miko, who just arrived, couldn't help but smile genuinely. Her pink tail then swayed as if it reflected her inner thoughts. Oh, Miko, perfect timing. Just then, Isaac finally noticed Ye Miko's presence and looked at her with a helpless expression. Can you look after the kids? I'm afraid that they might accidentally split up an atom and well. Hearing Isaac's sarcastic words and the clear hint of despair present in his voice, Yamiko, a new party that arrived, scoffed. That's right, this warm atmosphere is the new entertainment I am now fond of. Smiling softly, she then looked at Isaac with a smug smile. After a moment, she opened her mouth. No, I don't think I will. And it just also happened that teasing Isaac was another form of amusement for her. Chapter 75, The Warmth of the Café 2. TSS. Raining again. Looking out the window, Isaac couldn't help but comment. It's been happening more frequently than it usually does. Is it Fontaine's rainy season or is Nouvellette okay? He half-jokingly thought to himself as he watched the dark clouds outside bring down droplets of water onto the city. The cold humidity of the rain slightly seeped into the café, mixing with the air-conditioned room, resulting in a slightly freezing temperature. Nonetheless, the combination of a hot brew from Isaac counteracts this temperature with a delicious warm drink. Retracting his gaze from the glass pane window, he looked back at his café. Once more, only a few customers were present, each minding their own business. In this tranquil café that shielded many from the rain, only the calm peaceful atmosphere was present. Mr. Isaac. Just then, a voice drifted over to his ear. Turning his head, Isaac found the little elf Klee trying to take a seat on the stool in front of the counter. What is it, Klee? He asked as he helped her get up from the chair. Weren't you playing with Nahida? I know, I just wanted to talk to you. Klee, who nestled on the stool, nodded her head as her innocent smile permeated her face. Finding himself with nothing else to do, Isaac shrugged and agreed to her. Placing down the teacup he was cleaning with a clean cloth, he spoke to her. Sure, why not? What do you want to talk about? Well. Klee hesitated at first, seemingly trying to find the right words for her sentence, but then she continued. Can you tell me a story, Mr. Isaac? A story? Momentarily taken aback by Klee's request, Isaac grasped his chin in contemplation. I can do that, but why all of a sudden? It's because of a promise I made to my friend, the traveler. Explained Klee as she recounted her memories. Before the traveler left, we promised to share stories. Ah! Immediately understanding what was going on, Isaac subconsciously nodded his head. I see. Was that friend of yours a blonde traveler with a floating companion, by any chance? Hey? Mr. Isaac, you know her. Surprised by Isaac's accurate description of the traveler, Klee's eyes glimmered with curiosity. That's right. The traveler helped me out so much when she was in Mondstadt. She said that she would visit from time to time, so that's why I have to collect as many stories as I can before we meet again. As Klee said this, she reached out for her backpack and took out her book full of scribbles, before placing it down on the counter. She then opened the book and flipped to a specific page and showed it to Isaac. See, Mr. Isaac? I've already gotten a lot. This one's from Albedo, oh, and this one's from Master Jean. She said as she pointed at the neatly written words that were not hers in the book. This one's from Bennett, it got burned a little. And this one's from Kea. Look, he even drew a pirate on the side. Seeing the child happily share the stories given to her, Isaac couldn't hope but let out a warm smile. That's nice, Klee. You have a lot of friends to share stories with you, how fun. That's right. Klee nodded her head happily as she looked at Isaac. She then took out a cute pen from her backpack and gave it to Isaac. Since you're also my friend, it's now your turn, Mr. Isaac. All right, I'll see what I can share. Accepting the cute pen from Klee, Isaac chuckled lightly. Well then. Where should I start? At that very moment, innumerable stories flashed through Isaac's mind. There were so many that he genuinely couldn't decide which to pick. Finally, after a few moments of contemplation, he decided on a story. I'll try this one. Lifting the cute pen, he placed his hand down on Klee's notebook and began writing while speaking. Say Klee. You know what a monster is, yet? Of course I do. Klee responded with a nod. She then reached for her backpack and took out a small scale. Look, this one's from a monster I got when I visited Xiao with Albedo one time. Is that a Geovishap scale? Seeing the item Klee brought out, Isaac momentarily paused before nodding his head with a wry smile. That's right. A monster like that. Anywho, the story I'm going to tell you tackles about a person who suddenly became half a monster. He explained as he wrote down a summarized version of the story he was thinking. Half a monster? How would that work? Curious by Isaac's story, Klee stood up from the chair and leaned over to the book to see what he was writing down. Careful, don't fall. Helping her stand up, Isaac helped her sit down on the counter. He then continued with an explanation, as I was saying. This person who suddenly became half a monster became confused about his predicament. He was full of fear and disbelief about what happened in just one night. That sounds awful. Mr. Isaac, would this be a good story to share? Sensing the somber vibe of the story Isaac was sharing, Klee couldn't help but ask with a worried expression. It sounds like a sad story. I won't lie, it indeed is a sad story. Pausing his writing, Isaac chuckled for a moment. Thinking for a moment, he then continued writing. But it's also a story about discovery and acceptance. Over time, that person discovered the other monsters that he was once afraid of. Isaac spoke with the same melancholy feel around him that everyone had been accustomed to. Those monsters also had their own lives and stories, and motivations for their reason to live. That half-monster person then grew close to those monsters, gradually becoming close and even becoming one of them. Isaac then paused and put down the cute pen he used. Turning his head over, he saw Klee attentively listening to him. Klee, who was immersed in Isaac's story, realized that he stopped and looked back at him. And then? What happened after, Mr. Isaac? Did that half-monster person become friends with the monsters? Yes, they became his new friends and became very close. Isaac nodded his head. He then looked out the window as his eyes fell into deep contemplation. They became his new pillars of support. In that new dark world he found himself in, he saw them as new hope. That man, who didn't have a clear purpose and where he wanted to go when he was thrust into that new world, decided to henceforth protect the new hope he found no matter the costs. As Isaac spoke, his voice grew heavier. His gaze then glanced over to Klee, Yamiko, and Nahida. However, even when he looked at them, a familiar figure with grayish-white hair still flashed through his mind. Thinking of this, his eyes fell heavy. All. For their sake. Mr. Isaac. Sensing Isaac's doleful expression, Klee couldn't help but ask out of curiosity. You sound sad. Is the story that sad? Realizing that he was tainting the serene atmosphere with his melancholic attitude, Isaac quickly assessed himself. Shaking his head, he quickly removed his previous sorrowful look and smiled softly at Klee. Haha, I apologize. Looks like I became too immersed. If the story's not to your liking, I can stop here. He suggested as he rested the cute pen down. What do you say? I think you should continue, Mr. Isaac. Klee, who was looking at the words Isaac had written down in her book, hummed. She then lifted her head and looked at him in the eye. Because I think you really wanted to tell this story. What a sharp child. Hearing this, a faint smile appeared on Isaac's face. All right. Then I'll continue. Now, where was I? Oh right. Later on, that half-monster kept his promise and protected them, going as far as to even leave them just so his ideal peace would be achieved. Isaac continued after picking up the cute pen. He then turned towards Klee and asked a question, can you guess what happens next? Does the half-monster reunite with his new friends? Klee, sensing Isaac's change in tone, quickly guessed. Clever you. Praising her, Isaac chuckled lightly. That's right. After a few arduous adventures, he ultimately returned to his friends. Well then. Placing down the cute pen for the last time, Isaac closed the hoon he was writing on and gave it back to Klee. My job here is done. Did you like the story? Although it was an ultra-condensed version of the story Isaac was thinking of, he felt like he made out the important points. After listening to Isaac's intriguing story, Klee nodded her head with a satisfied smile. She then took back the book she gave. I feel like this would be a great story to tell the traveler. Thank you, Mr. Isaac. A sweet innocent smile permeated throughout her face as she thanked him. It's nothing. Looking at Klee's thankful face, Isaac smiled faintly. He then helped her get down the counter. All right, let's get you down, shall we? All right. With the help of Isaac, Klee successfully got down from the counter and returned to her seat. Just as Klee was about to get out of her seat, she stopped for a moment as a thought crossed her mind. She then looked back at Isaac and asked a question. By the way, Mr. Isaac. I want to ask a question. What is it? He responded. What did that half-monster do while he was distancing himself from his friends? She asked innocently. Upon hearing this, Isaac stayed silent for a moment. However, he then answered with a faint smile on his face. He met an inspiring figure that woke him up from his fake dream while away. Isaac stayed silent for a moment again before gesturing to Klee. Wanna hear the name of that person? Sure. Curious as to what the person's name was, Klee went back and leaned over, listening to Isaac intently. Isaac, who was smiling faintly, then whispered silently. The Nameless King. Eerie. The Nameless King. Hearing this name, Klee thought for a moment before turning back to Isaac. Mr. Isaac, do you want to write down that person's name? How about we keep it a secret for now? Winking at Klee, Isaac chuckled wryly. Let's keep it a secret from the traveler until the right moment, yeah? A little secret between us, if you will. Would that be all right, Klee? Oh. Realizing that it was a secret, Klee immediately nodded her head. Seeing Isaac's secretive actions, she followed along. Whispering, she replied, I'll keep it a secret, Mr. Isaac. Thanks, Klee. He thanked her with a genuine smile. Well then, why don't you go back? I'm sure Nahida's getting teased to oblivion by that sly fox by now. All right. Thank you again for the story, Mr. Isaac. Waving at Isaac, Klee ran back to the table where the other two were. No worries. Seeing Klee leave, Isaac watched in silence for a moment before letting out a small sigh. Confiding to others like this is really thrilling, isn't it? Unbeknownst to Klee, Isaac had just told her one of the most important details about his grand plan. Looking at the world outside the glass pane again, Isaac let out a small sigh. Such was the life of a fool. Just then, while Isaac was in the middle of gazing outside, the door suddenly opened, and in came a person. Oh. Seeing who it was, Isaac couldn't help but raise an eyebrow. He then greeted the new guest that just entered. A bit rainy today, innit? How do you do? Xiao. Chapter 76, The Warmth of the Café 3. Looking at Xiao, who was slightly drenched with water, Isaac let out a wry smile. He then gestured, need a towel? No need. Upon realizing the inconvenience he brought, Xiao snapped his fingers. In just a moment, the wind started to envelop his body, drying him of any liquid. Elements like this are easily removable. How convenient. Isaac maintained a courteous smile while secretly being envious. He then uttered, the usual. The usual. Xiao nodded as he sat down on one of the stools in front of the counter. All right, just wait a moment. Nodding his head, Isaac left to fetch Xiao's usual order, which consisted of lavender tea with a squeeze of lemon and almond tofu. Watching Isaac leave for his order, Xiao moved his eyes and looked at the other people present in the cafe. Good afternoon, conqueror of demons. The one who greeted him, Ye, said with a smile. Have you been well? I'm fine. Xiao gave a direct answer. He cared little for small talk and liked to get straight to the point. That's quite good to hear. Ye Miko nodded her head with a satisfied smile. She then walked over and sat on the stool next to Xiao. She then lowered her voice and glanced over at him. With a soft voice, she uttered, regarding that matter we spoke of. I won't say a single word. Xiao closed his eyes before letting out a faint sigh. From his expression, it seemed that he had no interest in what Ye Miko was mentioning. Such meaningless things. I care little for them. Rest assured that I will not disclose it to anyone. Thank you. Upon hearing his words, Ye Miko's face brightened as she felt a sense of relief. Other than you, no one else knows that we can still access the cafe at night, so for now, it's best to keep it for ourselves. The two have reached a mutual understanding regarding this matter. As long as the other doesn't expose this to the children, then it would be fine. Still, just then, Xiao glanced over to Ye Miko. He then continued with the same disinterested voice, I don't think even Isaac knows of this. Hearing this, Ye Miko paused for a moment before letting out a soft chuckle. She then rested her hand on her face and looked back at him with an amused look. That's why we should keep it a secret. Xiao took his gaze off Ye Miko and closed them. He then let out a faint sigh. As long as you do not harm anyone. I'm glad we both have a good mutual understanding. She replied with a satisfied smile. Ding! Just then, the doorbell chimed and a familiar figure walked through. It was none other than Nahida. Good afternoon, everyone. The familiar soothing voice of the silver-haired child chimed in. Good afternoon, Nahida. Klee waved back at her friend with a joyous smile. She then ran up to her. Did you find what I was looking for? Hehe, I did, but I'm afraid it won't be easy for me to take it out. Nahida smiled at Klee as she lightly shook her head. Although I did manage to learn its blueprints. I can give it to you if you want. Upon hearing this, Klee nodded her head in excitement. She then immediately shook Nahida's hands with both of her hands. Really? Thanks. And what is it that made my dear little Klee so excited today? Maiko's curious words then drifted over to the two children. Its Klee was just about to respond when she suddenly stopped. She then looked around and saw that Isaac was nowhere to be seen. After making sure that Isaac wasn't around, she continued. It's a surprise gift for Mr. Isaac. A gift? What's the sudden occasion? Still curious, Maiko continued to ask. This too, was a fork of entertainment for her. Since Klee had given Mr. Isaac quite a few headaches in the past already. I suggested this as compensation. At this moment, Nahida joined the conversation and answered Klee. Isaac is a pragmatic materialist, as such, I figured that giving him a functional gift as a form of compensation would relieve Klee of her previous wrongdoings, to some extent. Now I'm curious. Intrigued by the secret being held by the two children, Maiko hummed. Well, there's no trouble waiting. Patience, too, is one of my virtues. Let's keep it a secret from Mr. Isaac until then. Nahida nodded her head in agreement. She then turned her head and noticed another person present. Looking at him, Nahida was the first to speak. Oh. It's you. You're Xiao, right? Maiko told me that you were the latest person invited by Isaac. Hello. Hearing Nahida talk to him, Xiao glanced over to her and lightly nodded his head. Yes, you're right. You must be Nahida. It's a pleasure to meet you. The conqueror of demons. Looking at Xiao, who was sitting down on the stool, Nahida's ever-so-active mind wandered. I heard that he's the last of the Yaksha. Looking at his current state, he looks to be suffering from some kind of curse, likely the lingering resentments of fallen demons and gods. However, despite that, as Nahida continued to observe Xiao, her verdant green eyes shined with a curious glimmer. Isaac still managed to offer peace to him. How magical! The four of them then started chatting amongst themselves, with Xiao being relatively silent most of the time. Occasionally, some Fontanian customers would look their way and notice their attire, but would soon turn their heads away when looking at the short person that was Xiao sitting near the counter. A few minutes passed by, and soon, Isaac came out of the kitchen carrying Xiao's orders. 1 lavender tea with a squeeze of lemon, and almond tofu. Isaac, with the same jovial smile and attitude, served the dishes in front of Xiao. Order up. You seem particularly lively today. Noticing Isaac's joyful attitude, Maiko raised her eyebrow in suspicion. Did something good happen? Yet, your smile is even brighter today. Soon after, Klee ran up to Isaac and pointed out his smile, supporting Ye's claim. Was it that obvious? Lowering his head in embarrassment, Isaac chuckled lightly. He then closed his eyes before exhaling a soft sigh. Well, it's nothing special, really. It's just that. Then, slowly, Isaac opened his warm amber eyes to see the four people gathered around him looking at his expression with interest. The warm, cozy atmosphere of the café and the tranquil environment he had created for troubled souls had, to some extent, also affected him. Looking at everyone, whose eyes were looking at him, Isaac's eyes softened as he felt a sense of belonging here. The warmth of the café enveloped him, giving him a cozy experience. Seeing you guys harmonize here, brings me a lot of joy. Really. It was a genuine statement. After a troubled episode of him collapsing and rethinking his decisions, a sense of belonging behind the warm counter was all he needed. Yes, he had caused a bit of trouble for the fate of this world, but he had also set up the stage where these people could meet and greet each other, bringing a tad bit more harmony. To him, that holds a more special place in his heart. Well, it seems that I've grown a lot on you, hey. Upon hearing Isaac's reply, Maiko's expression also softened as she conjured a satisfied smile. That makes me delighted. Indeed. Isn't that right, Xiao? Maiko then turned over to the person next to her and passed the conversation. won't object to the notion. Holding his cup of tea, Xiao responded with a calm tone. Although I prefer solitude most of the time. But socializing is important, Mr. Xiao. Just then, Nahida joined the conversation. I believe that a decent amount of socializing is good for the mind. As for me, talking to Klee is, indeed great. Nahida, who was beside Klee, nodded her head as she agreed with Isaac's notion. Guiding her like a teacher makes me feel joy too. It's a profound feeling, even. And learning from Nahida is the best. Klee, beside her, giggled joyously. She then continued and pointed at everyone. And Ye Maiko is the best. And the scary Xiao is the best. And Mr. Isaac is the best. Klee pointed at Isaac lastly with her same innocent smile and childish wonder present in her lively eyes. Isaac, who heard Klee's compliments, was momentarily taken aback. For a moment, he fell into silence. PFT, haha. However, his silence was soon broken by a laugh that escaped his mouth which gradually got more energetic. Haha. Yet? Is that right? Maybe you're right. I'm glad everyone here feels the same. Realizing that his plan of serenity had taken effect and everyone was comfortable with each other, an innate sense of joy formed in Isaac. Finishing his laugh, Isaac calmed himself down and once more looked at everyone around him. Then, with a satisfied smile, he uttered softly, I'm glad. Hanging on to this fragile thread of hope I created. Isn't so bad. He thought with a light smile. Maybe. I should postpone that plan of mine at a much later date. I still have a lot of time, after all. In this little world he created, the serenity he finds was everything. Thus comes forth the warmth of the café. Unbeknownst to Isaac, however, is that a certain harbinger was now planning to head to his café. There truly is no rest for the wicked. Chapter 77, Warmth? Or Fire? By the way, Xiao, who was in the middle of drinking his lavender tea, suddenly remembered something and turned to Isaac. Regarding the traveler. Isaac, whose ear caught Xiao's words, immediately interrupted him. He then smiled at Xiao with a cold smile. Oops, please refer to our fellow members by their code names. Mr. Devil. Xiao, upon hearing Isaac's ludicrous request, momentarily fell silent as he was lost for words. Are we speaking with our code names? Ye Maiko, who has caught on to their conversation, joined in. Holding a book she had brought, she approached them. If so, then Miss High Priestess is here to join in. Miss Magician and Miss Hermit, come here if you will. Ye Maiko then raised her voice and called upon two more code names. Did someone call us? Klee, along with Nahida, walked over next to Ye Maiko. With a curious expression, her face looked at Ye Maiko. Miss Magician. Present. Miss Hermit. Also present. Nahida said beside Klee as they both looked up at Ye Maiko in front of them. Seeing Ye Maiko summon all the members of Isaac's club, a small smile formed on his face. Placing his hands on the counter, he smirked at Xiao. We all agreed to refer to each other by code names when other customers are around to hide your identities. When talking about our fellow members, it is best to stay in character. Isaac said as he cleaned the teacup in his hands with a clean cloth. Upon hearing Isaac, Xiao's eyebrows twitched with confusion. He then decided to speak up his thoughts, and your code name is? Isaac, who was expecting the question, curled up a smirk and replied a moment after his question. Hanged Man. After saying this, Isaac pulled up his fingers and started counting more members in his little club. There's also Mr. Chariot, Mr. Tower, Miss Star, Miss Moon, and Mr. World. Right now, they aren't here with us as they're all busy with their personal matters. Chariot referred to Luaka, Tower referred to Moriarty, and World referred to Gehrman. Putting all of them together with their code names and identities, Isaac had practically made a good baseline for his identities to the other members. Caressing his temples, Xiao took a moment of silence with his eyes closed before looking back at Isaac. Then, regarding Miss Star and Miss Moon. My original purpose for coming here is to tell you that I've recently met them. He explained as he recalled his experience. They told me that Rex Lapis had passed on, and they're being blamed for it. Hearing this, Isaac was glad that everything was going according to the original story. He then chimed in, I'm guessing since we had our agreement. Xiao nodded in understanding. After hearing their story, I made my own decisions and decided that I will side with them. Although that would still happen regardless, I'm glad. Satisfied with Xiao's response, Isaac exhaled a sigh of relief. That's good. Miss Star and Miss Moon are valuable staff to my cafe. It would be a shame if something happened to them. As such, it's nice that Mr. Devil is looking out for them. Isaac gestured at Xiao while looking at Ye Miko and the others. I'm still not used to this name. Xiao shook his head as he turned his head over to his almond tofu. But I'll leave it at that. I quite like it. It's like we're in some kind of a secret society. Ye Miko conjured her signature amused smile as she found the whole code names interesting. I like mine too. It's because I'm also a magician. Like my mum. Klee, who was talking with Nahida, turned her head and agreed with Ye Miko. Following Klee, Nahida also agreed with the matter. With her usual soft voice, she spoke, Hermit. It suits me well. It perfectly encapsulates who I am currently. Hearing all of the members express their satisfaction, Isaac nodded his head with satisfaction as well. He had grown tired of referring to the invited people as is, as such, he decided to form this little club to add a bit of a twist to their gatherings. The result was far better than he expected. Well, I'm glad that you all liked your code names. Be sure to use them whenever someone else is with us to avoid confusion. Isaac placed down a teacup and smiled softly. His warm amber eyes then glanced at all of them as he spoke, carry these names with dignity for our club. Our. Ha. Smiling as if finding it amusing, Isaac scoffed for a moment before continuing his sentence. Tarot Club. In the blink of an eye, a few days have already passed. Despite this, Isaac's peaceful life never changed. Enjoying each moment of the day, Isaac managed his cafe diligently for the past few days. Be it new or old customers, he welcomed them with his signature amiable smile and reaped wealth from their pockets. Occasionally, all the members of the club would gather and Isaac would host either a board game or something interesting. However, most of the time, only a few members of the club actually visit, with the ever-so-energetic Klee being the most frequent. Other than that, everything else was nothing but a regular day for the same old Isaac. And today was no different. Staring outside the cafe, Isaac, who had just gotten up and cleaned himself, looked at the clean street outside with hazy eyes. He then mumbled to himself, another day. Another grind. Placing his hand over his nape, he tilted his head slightly to relieve his neck of any stiffness. Feeling satisfied, he exhaled a soft sigh. All right. Let's do this. Rejuvenated for another day, Isaac cleaned up the cafe and made sure everything was prepared. After making sure everything was tidy and clean, he flipped the signboard outside, thus opening the cafe for another day. Afterwards, Isaac, behind the counter, took a bag of beans and placed it in the cabinet beneath the counter, directly under the coffee machine for easy access. Ding! So early. Hearing the bell of the door chime, Isaac took his head out of the cabinet beneath the counter and poked his head out to greet the new customer. Good morning. Oh. Isaac greeted the customer with the same amiable smile but then recognized who it was. Your Grace? You're quite early today, aren't you? Yes, it was none other than the warden of the fortress of Meropid, Xiao Thesli. With the same sharp yet languid eyes, Xiao Thesli looked at Isaac before forming a soft smile. Ever heard the saying? The early bird gets the worm. Xiao Thesli then looked around the cafe before smirking. He then walked over in front of the counter and crossed his arms. Well, since I'm your first customer for the day, I believe I deserve a good brew, yet. You must be joking. Finding Xiao Thesli's words interesting, Isaac smirked. He then picked up a teacup. I always make the best brew for my customers. What would you like today? Isaac had already dropped Xiao Thesli's title as the warden and comfortably spoke to him. Chamomile. Xiao Thesli answered as he went and sat down on one of the stools in front of the counter. Something sweet in the morning. No offense, but that's an odd choice. Isaac voiced his opinion as he went and prepared Xiao Thesli's tea. Just treat it as the warden's oddity, Xiao Thesli replied with a wry smile. He then continued, but it's more for the sugar rush. You get it, surely. That makes more sense. Isaac shared the same wry smile upon realizing Xiao Thesli's reason. Well, I ain't complaining. Isaac then shrugged his shoulders and went to the kitchen to boil some water for the tea. Inside the kitchen, Isaac patiently waited for the water to boil. As he did so, his thoughts started to wander off. I wonder how Furina is doing. He wondered as his gaze drifted to the corner of the room. In his mind, the face of his Archon emerged. That movie we made should be released in a few days. I trust that her team did a good job editing it. Regardless, as soon as they're done editing and publishes the movie, my side quest would be completed and I'd have a major boost in fighting prowess. As for Linny, Lynette, and Freminette, as well as the Hearth. Remembering his current main quest, a quiet sigh escaped Isaac's mouth. Ha! Well, at least there's progress there. Lastly, the plan. Isaac wanted to avoid this thought the most, but it still rose in his mind. I need 2 important people for it to work. And they just happen to be the hardest people to approach. Remembering the details of his plan, Isaac habitually grasped his chin. Well, at least my bargaining chip is already done. Spending the nights reinforcing my Gehrman persona in the shadows paid off well. Isaac had been busy the last few nights going around the shadows of Fontaine and hunting down thugs and making them obey him. Traitors who used to serve Marcel were immediately subdued by Isaac and brought back under his control. Not only that, but the major crime rings connected to the synth trade were also brought under his rule. Now, most of the major crime organizations are under Marcel's, or rather, Isaac's control. Unbeknownst to them, however, is that they are all nothing but a chip in Isaac's grand gamble. Were. Hearing the water boil, Isaac snapped out of his contemplation and returned his attention to the tea. Shortly after the water boiled, Isaac brewed the tea and, after a few minutes, left the kitchen to serve it to Ryo Thesly. Here's your chamomile. Still piping hot. Isaac stepped out of the kitchen door with the same amiable smile and spoke to Ryo Thesly. Have a good morning. Hey. However, his sentence was soon cut off when he noticed another person sitting beside the warden of Meropid. Oh. Isaac. Just in time. Upon noticing Isaac, Ryo Thesly turned his head and looked at Isaac with a look of anticipation. With a languid smile, he spoke. A new customer just arrived. She and I have been chatting, and I'm surprised to discover another tea connoisseur here in Fontaine. Why don't you introduce yourself? Ryo Thesly then looked at the person next to him. I don't believe Isaac knows of you yet. Yes. The person next to Ryo Thesly replied with a relaxed yet intimidating tone. However, strangely, a sense of gentleness was present. Isaac, whose eyes never left the person, almost felt like something was stuck in his throat. For a moment, he couldn't utter a word. The person who Ryo Thesly was talking to turned her head, revealing her full face, and looked at Isaac. Greetings. I am the current head of the House of the Hearth, and I believe you are already acquainted with my children. You may refer to me as Arlecchino. That familiar pristine silver hair, coupled with those iconic crossed red eyes, Isaac couldn't mistake it for anyone else even if he wanted to. Number 4 of the Fatui Harbingers. Arlecchino. Chapter 78, Scary, innit? Linny, why did you call me here? Lynette, wearing the same poker face and monotone voice, spoke to her brother. Currently, both of them were atop a rooftop, stealthily avoiding the attention of anyone. Linny, on the other hand, was holding a binocular as he looked in the distance. With their current position, they had a good elevated view of their surroundings. As he continued to look in a certain direction, he responded to his sister's question. Father entered Mr. Isaac's café. Isaac. Hearing this name, Lynette's ears twitched as she recalled Isaac's face. Having remembered him, she continued, what does father want with him? I don't know. But given that he had already been within father's sights for a while now, I guess father had seen something in him. Linny gave his thoughts and speculation over the situation, though he was still unsure of the details. Father knew of him. Lynette, the first time hearing of this, inquired further. She then walked over beside him and looked at the café not far away. Linny nodded his head as he continued his observation. That's right. At first, it was a report about his identity, but as time went on, father started requesting his habits. Habits? That means. Upon realizing what their father was planning, a thought blossomed in Lynette's mind. Linny, on the other hand, merely nodded his head as he let out a soft sigh while keeping a lookout on the café. I just hope Mr. Isaac would get on father's good side. It's truly a beautiful morning, isn't it, Monsieur Isaac? Arlecchino, who was sitting right beside Ryo Thesly, spoke to Isaac with a gentle yet heavy tone. She had yet to order anything and was thus just sitting down. It truly is, innit? Isaac, on the other hand, remained calm and collected on the surface despite having inner turmoil. Why is she here? Behind Isaac's calm facade, a question had repeatedly resurfaced in his mind while looking at the knave. I haven't done anything to provoke the Fatui, right? No, surely not. He reassured himself with a false sense of hope. Still, he remained optimistic. For now, let's try to be as calm as possible and avoid any unnecessary trouble. With an amiable smile, Isaac spoke with the same gentle tone. What would you like to have, my good customer? Green tea. No additives. She answered, maintaining direct eye contact with Isaac. No additives. Got it. Taking her order, Isaac went and grabbed his kettle in the kitchen, which was still very hot. He then started brewing her tea in front of her to let her see the process in person. After a few minutes, the tea was ready and he placed it on top of a porcelain coaster along with a silver teaspoon before giving it to the knave. Here you go. Freshly brewed. Isaac said as he slid the teacup to her carefully. Green tea with nothing else in it, hey? I'm guessing you like the natural flavors of tea. Xiao, who was quietly enjoying his tea for a while now, looked at the knave. The knave turned her head and nodded at Xiao's words. She then opened her mouth and spoke, indeed. I dislike overly flavorful things and prefer simpler and pristine flavors such as these. Hear that, Isaac? Upon hearing this, Xiao smiled smugly before turning over to Isaac. I told you she knows her stuff. It seems she does. Isaac nodded his head and agreed with Xiao. He had to admit, she knows her stuff. Very few appreciate the raw taste of tea without any additional contents like sugars, so it's refreshing to see someone who sticks by the classics, Isaac explained. Although he was scared, he couldn't help but praise the knave as a tea enthusiast himself. It's just my preference, that is all. The knave responded to Isaac while observing him closely. However, she then turned her head to the person next to her Xiao and spoke. Moreover, I didn't know that your grace was also an enthusiast of tea. This is the first I've heard of this. She said as her crossed red eyes locked onto the warden of Meropid. My hobbies aren't widely known to the public, as you may know. Xiao, beside her, replied with a light smile. His languid sharp eyes then looked at her from the side. As do you. Are they pretending to not know each other's identities? Sensing an invisible tension between the two, the nervous Isaac decided to intervene. Ahem, from the looks of it, you two are already well acquainted. Isaac cleared his throat and said with a curious tone, indicating his lack of knowledge over the matter to them. Isaac was well aware that Arlecchino was relatively less known than the rest of the Harbingers, as her line of work mainly tackles information gathering. However, even then, the Duke of the Fortress of Meropid still has eyes and ears on the surface, despite it being under the waves. The knave was actively trying to infiltrate the fortress, while the Duke was capturing and interrogating her spies. Naturally, the two know each other. What they did not know, however, is that Isaac, too, was aware of both of their identities. This feels like that one Spider-Man meme with the 3 spy days pointing at each other. Isaac thought humorously amidst the tension. During such a tense moment, he couldn't help but lighten up the mood, at least for himself. Xiao first looked at the knave before looking back at Isaac. He then curled up a soft smile before speaking. Not really. I've just known her from some colleagues, that's all. I believe everyone in Fontaine who has read the newspaper has heard of the Duke of Meropid. The knave answered as she also took her eyes off Xiao. Ah, I see. That makes more sense now. Isaac nodded his head in understanding, acting as if everything had just clicked in his mind. Well, that's enough from me. Just then, Xiao finished drinking from his cup and stood up. I should be heading off soon. He then took out some mora and placed it stacked on the counter, right in front of Isaac. Once more, the brew was rich. Xiao complimented Isaac as he paid for his drink. If I find myself some free time again, I'll drop by once more. Of course. Great minds who think alike are always welcomed in my humble café. Isaac smiled softly at him as he took the stack of mora. He then bid him farewell. Have a good day, dear customer. Thanks. Xiao nodded as he turned around. But not before looking at the knave one last time from the corner of his eyes. With a light smirk, he spoke to her with a concealed sarcasm hidden in his tone. It was nice chatting with you. I hope to have another wonderful time next time we meet. I could say the same, Your Grace. In response, the knave didn't turn her head and merely replied with a cold tone. May we meet again in the future? Lightly scoffing at her response, Ryo Thesli didn't say anything further and turned around before walking away. Ding! And just like that, the Duke of the Fortress of Meropid had departed, leaving only Isaac and the dangerous Harbinger in the café. Why is she here again? After seeing Ryo Thesli leave, Isaac turned his eyes to the knave and warily looked at her. She's not here to hurt me, is she? Heavens, I hope not. Just then, while Isaac was in the middle of his thoughts, the knave, who was stirring her green tea, spoke. You and my children have been working on the same movie, have you not? Why is she asking that? Curious to her question, Isaac reciprocated and answered her question. That's right. Linny and Lynette have been good actors so far. They're great at it. They also said the same to you. The knave said as she closed her eyes for a moment. They told me about your excellent acting skill, almost as if you were experiencing your character's every bit of sensation, projecting it to the audience. Isaac thought he was praising her, but a moment later, her tone became cold and heavy, immediately forcing a tense atmosphere between them. Truly a great performance, Monsieur Isaac. Or should I call you? She then opened her eyes, revealing her crimson-red crossed eyes, looking directly at Isaac with nothing but a menacing glare. Her lips parted, uttering another name, Gehrman. Isaac, upon hearing this, almost jumped out of fright. But he restrained himself and kept a composed composition. Lifting his head, his warm amber eyes locked in with her and he spoke as calmly as possible. Gehrman? I don't get what you mean. Have you confused me with someone else? The knave, upon hearing this, scoffed coldly. She then lifted her green tea and took a sip before speaking. You know, I'm not an avid believer of coincidences. But when they stack up too high, you can't help but see a common pattern among them. The establishment of your café, the grand thievery, the controversial gift, and the abduction of the Archon. She recounted every major operation Isaac had done in order while speaking calmly. All appear to be disconnected, yet share one common denominator. A lead actor was present in all of them, pushing the plot of the performance forward. She said as she put down her teacup before looking up at Isaac. In just a short amount of time, they had caused quite the stir in Fontaine. Isn't that right, Monsieur Isaac? Is that so? Isaac, who was originally frightened of the knave since earlier, was now, on the contrary, calm both internally and externally. Staring at the knave eye to eye, his warm amber eyes locked in with her red crossed eyes, and a moment of silence enveloped the two. Ha! Then, a soft sigh escaped Isaac's mouth. He then put his hands behind his back and looked at the knave before smiling softly. So what's your purpose here, I wonder? To determine if you are an obstacle to be eliminated. The knave didn't sugarcoat her words and went straight to the point. You are a strange variable. And determining your worth is how I'd deal with you. My worth, eh? Haha. Upon hearing this, Isaac first smiled before bursting into a laugh. I see. I didn't think it would come to this so easily. He thought as his warm amber eyes squinted. Then, are you interested in what I have to offer? He asked with a calm facade. To show my worth. It depends if it will be in my best interest. If not, well. She said to him but didn't continue her sentence, knowing he knew what she meant. Upon hearing her answer, Isaac nodded lightly before opening his mouth and uttering his offer. Are you interested in a collaboration? And by collaboration, you mean? The knave asked him while maintaining her cold tone. Well, you are aware of the current situation of Fontaine, yes. He said as he looked outside the café, and onto the streets. I believe you, too, know that the prophecy is slowly coming true. After saying this, Isaac turned his head back to her and continued speaking. What I want to do is simple. It's to find a way to minimize that catastrophe's casualties as minimal as possible. Minimize? You aren't trying to stop it? The knave asked as her eyes squinted and looked at him solemnly as she spoke with a heavy tone. Prophecies cannot be stopped, and can only be prepared for. Isaac lifted his hand as he tapped his temples while smiling at the knave. Arlecchino, I want to offer you a collaboration that would benefit the hearth, Fontaine, and me. Upon hearing Isaac's offer, the knave became silent for a moment, and took the moment to listen to him, seemingly interested in his offer. Still, Her menacing and solemn look was present on her face. I'm listening. Isaac, with his hands behind his back, softly smiled at her before speaking. Are you interested in crowning a king? A nameless king. Chapter 79, Mentor and Disciple. Mr. Isaac. Aren't you coming to the opera house? Freminute, who was beside Isaac, said as he poured boiling water onto a teacup. Why would I? Isaac, wearing his usual attire of a black waistcoat and white dress shirt, scoffed lightly. Well, if I remember correctly, a film festival is being held there right now. Freminute said with his usual soft tone. Since you, Linny, and Lynette partook in a movie to be released there, I thought you would have gone to see its opening. That is true. But then what? Isaac, cleaning a teacup, nodded his head before softly sighing. Other than applause, I'd gain nothing else just by being there. I'll just be there for the sake of it. As such, I'd leave it to the capable Lady Furina. He continued speaking. She's more suited for the crowds than me. She can handle it well. It was true. Isaac was never truly a person to show himself in front of so many people at once, and preferred to talk to a small group of people. As such, he decided to leave everything to Furina. Furthermore, he also told her to promote his shop if she could. Well, moving on from that, Isaac then turned his head over to Freminute and smiled with satisfaction. You're getting better and better at brewing, Freminute. Continue at this pace and I might just hire you. Well, I owe this to you, Mr. Isaac. Freminute, who was also wearing the same attire as Isaac, lowered his head and muttered softly. If you hadn't taught me, I wouldn't have picked up this hobby. It's not all on me, you know. Isaac admired Freminute's humility but decided to not accept it. You have a natural talent for remaining calm in tense situations. Having that in itself is a skill. Is that so? Freminute replied, hanging his head low. Although he tried it, Isaac still managed to get a glimpse of his red-tinged face. What an honest kid. Seeing Freminute's reaction, Isaac chuckled lightly to himself as he cast his sights on the café. Ever since I started mentoring him, he's been doing a great job following my steps. I wonder, would this disciple of mine who is still training one day surpass me in terms of brewing? Looking at the quiet café he had built with a few rich customers, Isaac first entertained the thought before immediately shaking his head. Nah, no way. Gotta be the best of the best and have a certain amount of quality to keep these loyal customers, after all. Isaac's pride didn't allow him to let his disciple surpass him by any means. Right. I'm just passing on my technique, that's all. Or was it more appropriate to call it an inheritance? Having finished his internal monologue, Isaac decided to change the subject. Oh, by the way, I met your father yesterday. Father? Our father? Freminute, taken aback by Isaac's sudden words, looked at him with slightly widened eyes. You met her? Why are you looking at me as if I survived a cataclysmic disaster? Maintaining his courteous smile, Isaac lightly nodded his head in agreement. That's right. She was a fine fellow, and we got along well. A bit on the cold side, but we made it work. He added. Upon hearing Isaac's description of Arlecchino, Freminute fell into a short moment of silence as if he were contemplating something. However, he soon shook his head. I'm glad that you and father got on good terms. Lifting his head, he looked at Isaac. Everyone in the hearth agrees that father is cold and strict. But deep down, we respect her. As such, it brings me joy that the two of you can get along. Freminute curled up a soft smile as he said this. Seeing him smile, Isaac still couldn't get used to it. He's been smiling a lot ever since I've taken him under my wing. It feels odd, but as long as he's happy and comfortable it is what it is. The fact that Freminute was comfortable enough to smile around Isaac shows that he had established a haven for Freminute in his café. As someone who wants nothing more than the peaceful minds of his customers, this just gives Isaac a reason to be happy for them. Yet? Then I'll make sure to treat her as best as I can. He said as his gaze looked back at him. I'm sure she and I would have some wonderful meetings in the future. As Isaac said this, the thought of his plan resurfaced in his mind. Remembering his grand plan, he looked at Freminute and recalled the faces of Linny and Lynette. A small, enigmatic smile then formed on his lips as he crossed his arms. Well, that's enough of that. Let's get back to your training. For your next brew, Let's try another espresso. Oh, all right. Approaching Isaac, Freminute stood beside him and watched the coffee machine. The day continued to move as Isaac taught Freminute his skills, while also using him as a staff in the café. Since Lumen was still busy dealing with the Lio crisis, Freminute was the only person Isaac could think of who could work for him. Of course, he was still paying him. Isaac might be greedy, but he wasn't a monster. Professionals have standards. And just like that, the afternoon passed by, setting the sun on the horizon. By Mr. Isaac. Freminute, who had now changed back to his usual casual attire, waved goodbye to Isaac from the door. Walk home safe. Isaac, who was wiping a table with a cloth, waved back at him. Yes. Freminute nodded his head before turning around and going through the door, leaving the café. Ding! Hearing the bell chime, Isaac stood up straight and looked at the door with languid eyes. He did well today. I should consider hiring him for real. After making this throwaway comment, Isaac scoffed at himself as if finding it amusing. Well, Arlecchino might perceive it differently, so there's that. Ha! Shaking his head, he shook off those thoughts out of his mind and focused on cleaning the glass table. Isaac cleaned each table diligently, not letting a single speck of anything dirty go untouched. A clean café was a good café, after all. Moreover, Isaac didn't want to be put on some kind of government list for poorly hygienic establishments, so there's that too. Ding! Just then, the bell of his door chimed, indicating a new customer had arrived. Welcome! Isaac was just about to turn and greet the customer when suddenly, he was jumped on. Getting grabbed by the neck, Isaac wanted to react in self-defense, when he noticed the person that jumped him. Hey! Wait! Furina! Hugging him by the neck, Furina, who jumped to Isaac after entering the café, looked at him with a bright smile and glistening eyes. You fool! You couldn't believe what happened today. She said as her hands never left his neck. Everyone loved the movie. All the judges gave good criticism and even wanted to buy the rights to publish it. The tale of the hunter whose past hunts him in his nightmares, but finds solace in the embrace of his new family, such a simple plot yet so powerful. Furina took one hand off from Isaac and imitated what seemed like one of the judges. Throughout her story, the look of pride never left her face. It's a phenomenal story, they said. Yeah? Well, that just means you did a great job writing the script and directing everything. Still locked on to Furina, Isaac smiled lightly as he praised her for her work. Hats off to the director. Oh come on now, Isaac, there's no need to be humble. Upon hearing Isaac's reply, Furina rolled her eyes as she leaned in closer to him. You also played a crucial role in this. Another judge states that your acting was immaculate and even wanted to get your information to scout you. That's to be expected. Acting is a must for a fool, after all. Isaac lampooned to himself. He then shook his head and replied to Furina. That might be so, but everyone who worked in the movie also did their best. For example, Linny and Lynette. He mentioned the two members of the Hearth. Oh, those two? Well, you're right. I also found their acting to be excellent. Perhaps if they're properly taught, they even become great actors in the future. Furina, at the mention of the two, nodded her head as she praised them. Yes, I should keep an eye out for those two. All right. Well then. After letting Furina speak, Isaac then looked at her with his warm amber eyes and chuckled lightly. Care to get off now? Upon hearing this, Furina realized that she had been hugging Isaac for a while now. However, instead of immediately leaving, she instead did something else. Make me! She declared boldly, staring eye to eye with Isaac directly in front of her. Oh! Realizing what Furina meant and wanted, Isaac raised an eyebrow at first before shaking his head with a smile. My, how bold! After saying this, Isaac leaned his face closer while also lowering his upper body to reach Furina. Shoo! In this quiet café of Isaac, the two shared a long deep kiss, sharing a moment of silence and sweetness. In the midst of this, Furina's ahog swayed a bit. Finally, after a few moments, they parted, and only then did Furina let go of Isaac. Hee, after a long day of dealing with all those people, a good recharge is all I needed. Placing her hands behind her, Furina smiled cheekily at Isaac as she breathed heavily. Isaac, whose face also had a tinge of red, tried to hide his face while trying to change the subject. Since you're here, do you want to have dinner? I'm planning to have chicken coffee tonight. Ha! As much as I want to, there are still a lot of things I have to do back at Palais Harmonia. Apparently, Nouvellette also wants to tell me something important. Furina replied with a soft sigh as the look of dejection was present on her face. Well, that's fine. Although it wasn't on Isaac's plan to share a dinner tonight, he still felt a bit of shame that Furina wasn't able to accompany him. Remember to eat well later though. He reminded her as he remembered her bad eating habits. And no sugars. What? Not even a slice of cake. Upon hearing Isaac, Furina immediately reacted and protested against it. Why not? It's bad for you. Isaac crossed his arms as he rolled his eyes while speaking solemnly. How about a creme brulee? Furina then tried to bargain with an alternative, but it was to no avail. No. He answered, not accepting any other excuses. Ah! Faced with Isaac's restrictions, Furina's head hung low as she lamented over this matter. A moment later, however, she lifted her head and looked at him with puffed-up cheeks. Fine then. You must think that I can't go a single day without sugar. But mark my words that I, Furina, have complete self-control. Do it, not say it. Isaac reminded her as he smiled softly, finding her rant amusing. Humph, fine. Turning around, Furina started walking over to the door. Well, that's all I have to say. I'll be going now. Would you be dropping by tomorrow? Isaac, watching her walk away, asked curiously. I don't know. I have many appointments and can't seem to fit a time for myself these days. Furina, on the other hand, answered as she stopped walking. She then shook her head. So no, I don't think I can. Well, that's a shame. Sighing, Isaac also shook his head. He then looked at her back and smiled with melancholy. Well, in case I don't see you. Good morning, good afternoon, and good night. Upon hearing Isaac, Furina stopped walking and turned around, only to see Isaac with a soft smile and languid eyes staring back at her. That's a sweet thing to say, she said as she continued to look back at him. A moment later, she smiled warmly at him. Thank you, Isaac. Plus 15. No problem. He nodded his head, not letting his eyes leave her. Ding. And just like that, Furina left, leaving Isaac by himself in his cafe once more, with nothing but the empty cups in the kitchen as his company. All right. Time to finish this. After staring at the door for a few minutes, Isaac finally returned to cleaning the cafe. It took a while, but he finally finished cleaning, and soon, it was closing time. He pulled the blinders down and locked the doors, and cooked himself a delicious dinner. After doing all of these, Isaac was finally ready to sleep. He headed upstairs and was about to lay on his bed when a notification suddenly appeared in front of him. Notice. The quest Good Hunter has been completed. The rewards shall now be granted. The host shall be forced to sleep to complete the process. Before Isaac could even process what the system said, his eyelids suddenly felt heavy, and his body also felt the same. Before Isaac knew it, he had already fallen asleep. And thus starts the transformation of not only his cafe but also his mind. Comment. 29 Comment. Vote. Chapter 80, Isaac loves upgrades. Bang. The sound of gunshots rang through Isaac's ear as his eyes locked onto the decaying body of what seemed like the corrupted body of a human. Looking coldly at the previously sane person moments ago before he transformed into a monster resembling a werewolf, Isaac frowned. He looked at his hands and saw that he was holding two things. One was a gigantic scythe whose sharpness could easily slash into the flesh of its victims, and another was a modified blunderbuss gun. Awoo! Bang! On this night covered by the crimson veil of the moon, all Isaac heard were the cries of the beasts as other hunters following him hunted them down with their trick weapons and guns. Not a single word escaped the mouths of each hunter present in this nightly hunt, only the gruesome sound of their weapons ripping off bloody flesh from the monsters echoed throughout the streets of the decaying city of Yaharnam. Isaac then looked up, only to see the crimson-red moon shining down on him, providing a bloody backdrop for their hunt. When will this end, Lawrence? Isaac's mouth moved on its own without his control, uttering a sentence as if lamenting. These beasts are never ending. Trust the process, Gehrman. Beside Isaac, a man clad in white garb spoke calmly as he watched the hunters take down monsters. I will soon make contact with Flora, and offer a proposal to them that will put an end to this horrible nightmare. Until then, continue hunting, Gehrman. The man named Lawrence said with a solemn voice as he looked at Isaac. I believe we will achieve our goal through this. Have faith. After saying this, Lawrence turned his back and walked away, disappearing from Isaac's view. The latter, on the other hand, looked at the dark city in front of him, which had horrible monsters hiding in the dark, awaiting their next victim. Holding tightly to his scythe and gun, Isaac swung his scythe first before resting it on top of his left shoulder. With his gun in his right hand, he paused for a moment before jumping down the rooftop which he was at. With nothing but strong conviction and responsibility to hunt the monsters of the night, Isaac silently muttered a sentence to himself. A hunter must hunt. As Isaac reached the bottom of the building he was at, the darkness beneath him slowly engulfed him, and once he arrived at the bottom, the silhouettes of various werewolf monsters looked at him. However, even at the sight of this, Isaac's expression never changed. Instead, fierceness appeared in his eyes as he changed postures. He then whispered to himself. What a terrible nightmare! After saying this, Isaac dived straight into the beasts. Before he could witness it though, his vision suddenly cracked as if a glass was shattered. Before Isaac could even start ripping the flesh from the beasts, his vision suddenly darkened as the cracks grew. Quest reward implementation completed. Café interior has been upgraded. Memories of Yaharnam's first hunter, 1/4, successfully implanted. Your skill, Evernight, grew more compatible with you. Isaac, who was lying down on his bed, looked at the system notification floating in front of him. His eyes, slightly moist and tired, looked at the notifications silently before he let out a sigh. That wasn't a pleasant feeling. My head hurts. I for sure didn't dream of that scene. Remembering what had happened earlier, Isaac put his hand over his forehead as he tried to rationalize his chaotic thoughts. That was definitely Gehrman's memories during the scourge of the beasts. His mind still in turmoil, Isaac slowly lifted himself from the bed and sat upright. He then looked at his hand, opened it, and closed it as if he was testing something. He then closed his eyes. This is reality. That memory felt a bit too real. I could still even recall the stench of the blood in the air. Isaac sighed softly as he let his arm down. He then stared up at the ceiling. For a few minutes, Isaac just laid down his bed and didn't do anything. However, he soon let out a low groan as if releasing his frustration. Well, since I gained a portion of Gehrman's memories, I should have also gained a portion of his experience, right? Wanting to test this theory, Isaac plans to go outside for a bit. However, just as he was about to leave his bed, his sense of balance became disoriented due to still adapting from the memory given by the system. Sh. He was about to fall from the side of his bed when suddenly, his body reflexively reacted fast and his hand stopped his fall. What the? Hey! Isaac was just about to wonder about his body's sudden movement when he realized another matter. Isaac looked at his room and noticed something off. He then immediately got the answer. He was upside down. More specifically, his one hand single-handedly lifted his whole body while he stayed still. Looking down or rather up, Isaac saw his whole body balance itself perfectly still. Faced with this, a wry smile appeared on his face. That's new. Controlling his body, Isaac slowly took control of his muscles and, slowly, he put himself down on the floor. After doing this, he stood up straight and pondered over this matter. Well, that should answer my question. I did have good reflexes, but they were never that extreme. He commented. I should take this moment to get familiar with my body again. After Isaac said this, he sat down on his bed and started meditating while doing small tasks like manually breathing and moving his fingers and toes, gradually regaining full control of his body. After what seemed like minutes, Isaac finally felt settled and opened his eyes. That should do it. He smirked as he moved his fingers. He then continued to mutter to himself, by the looks of it, my body seems to have developed an instinct to protect itself. Albeit extremely. Not only that, but I also seem to have grasped some bits of knowledge about guns and fighting styles. He added. I bet I'd do well with a scythe or something. He joked to himself, letting out a small chuckle. Looking out the window in his room, Isaac saw the rays of sunlight going through the glass, bathing his room with light. He then turned his head and looked at the clock. 8 in the morning. I slept too much. Realizing this, Isaac stood up and looked around his room for a bit before deciding to clean himself. I should go take a shower first. After that, it's another day for the café. After muttering this, Isaac did just that. After taking a bath, Isaac decided that it was time to have a quick breakfast. He went downstairs and opened the door to the kitchen. Oh! However, when he entered, he immediately noticed something different. This. When did this place get bigger? The kitchen was now twice as big as it previously was. Moreover, there are also new tools and equipment present that weren't there before. This must be the upgrade the system mentioned. Isaac said to himself as he went around and inspected the expanded kitchen. There weren't any changes upstairs. So I'm guessing the upgrade only happened here. After checking the kitchen, Isaac once more opened a door leading to the counter of the café. When he opened the door, it was as he had expected. Upon seeing the changes, a small gasp escaped his mouth. Whoa! The café was now bigger, and could now accommodate more tables. Just like the kitchen, it had grown twice as wide inside. Of course, Isaac's counter also expanded, with new equipment appearing like 2 more brewing machines. Since it was only an interior upgrade, I'm guessing the café outside still looks the same. Thinking of this, a troubled expression appeared on Isaac's face. The customers would undoubtedly notice the changes. Thinking over this matter, Isaac pondered for a few moments before letting out a small sigh. Ah, whatever, I'll just tell them that I got a mysterious sigil from someone from Liu. Isaac scratched the back of his head. That should be a good reason. Liu's adepti were known to create artificial spaces as their abodes and can alter the space inside them by either expanding or shrinking them. As such, an excuse like a random sigil from Liu was enough for Isaac to use as an excuse. Moving on from this matter, Isaac set his eyes on the new café. He then smiled with vigor. All right. Let's start a new day. After saying this, Isaac started cleaning up the newly expanded café, while also placing down new tables and chairs from the system store function. He made sure to keep the café's comfortable atmosphere as cozy as possible by adding warm lighting. It was basically just Isaac's normal café but with more tables now. Finally, after cleaning up and renovating the new café, he walked over to the door and flipped the sign open. Afterward, he returned to his counter and started preparing his morning coffee. I should try my new Gearman abilities later in the woods. That would be fun. Isaac, who was pouring hot water in his cup, muttered to himself. Ha! This reward is so useful. With this, my defense has gone up once more. Another layer of defense to preserve his life was always welcomed by Isaac. Previously, he wasn't good at hand-to-hand combat, but now, he was positive that he could take on any normal person that he crossed paths with under normal circumstances. Ding! Just then, the bell of the door chimed, indicating that a new customer had appeared. Welcome! Turning his head, Isaac looked at his customer. However, he soon immediately recognized who it was. Oh my, if it isn't Miss Navia. Good morning, mademoiselle. Isaac said with a courteous smile, welcoming her. You're early today. And you don't seem to be accompanied by your usual entourage. That's right, Silver and Melissa are currently unaware of my location. Navia, who was wearing a casual outfit and a pair of sunglasses, nodded her head. She then took off her glasses, revealing her beautiful blue eyes. However, I believe it won't be long before they track me down. Did you sneak out or something? Or did you do something that would make you want to avoid them? Isaac, curious about her current situation, asked. He then decided to humorously tease her. Gosh, I hope you didn't do anything illegal, mademoiselle. Oh, to be an accomplice. Haha, that's a nice joke, Monsieur Isaac. Finding Isaac's sarcastic acting funny, Navia chuckled. She then walked over to the counter with a soft smile. But unfortunately, I didn't do anything of sorts. I merely wanted to act independently for today. Why's that? Upon hearing her reason, Isaac raised an eyebrow. Navia, who was looking at Isaac, opened her mouth and was about to say something when she suddenly stopped. Well. She then paused for a moment and entered what seemed like a moment of contemplation. Isaac didn't interrupt her and merely remained stationary, while also making his cup of coffee. After a few moments, however, Navia finally made up her mind and spoke. Say, Isaac, you were Lady Furina's assistant for a time, right? Indeed. Isaac softly smiled as he agreed to her question. He then continued, boasting. I was quite good at it. My side job of being a private investigator helped me a lot. An investigator. Upon hearing this, Navia's mind churned as her eyes blinked twice before she smiled brightly. That's it. This could work. She then placed both of her hands on the counter and locked eyes with Isaac. She then smiled at him. Monsieur Isaac, I want to hire you. Why am I getting déjà vu? Isaac looked back at Navia with a wry smile and quickly responded. Well. What do you need me for, exactly? Will you promise you won't tell anyone? She said as she continued to have a staring contest with Isaac. Not even with Lady Furina. I promise. Isaac, not wanting to lose in what seemed like a staring contest, nodded his head. Confidentiality is also the name of the game to us private investigators. Yet? All right. Receiving Isaac's reply, Navia looked around for a bit before leaning in closer to him and whispering, actually, the reason I wanted to be independent today is because I believe I found the masked clown. She said, with conviction present in her eyes. As well as the painting of Lady Furina he stole. Isaac, upon hearing this, maintained his curious look. However, deep down, he was chuckling to himself. Oh. Right. I did leave out clues for that painting. To think that it was Navia who found it first. Isaac smirked internally. Finding this development entertaining, he continued to ponder. Well, since I've already been invited, it wouldn't hurt to observe her as she figured out the puzzle, right? And so starts the partnership of the president of the Spina di Rosala and the owner of a humble cafe. A/N. Koro, holding a gun, pointed at the author named Unusual as he spoke calmly. Share the invite code to the server. The author of a crack FIC, Unusual, looked back at him and replied, but what's the point? Besides providing notifications when I upload a new chapter, our server is long dead. That's because you let it die. You never invite new members and you barely come online to start a conversation. Wiz, another person present at the scene, said as he loaded his rifle. He then pointed it at Unusual. Me, Paragon, Wiz, Seeker, Koro, Dust, Inchel, and Sticko are the only ones talking in this grave site. But you can still bring it back to life. Wiz continued to speak. Share the code in your next release, Unusual. That way, we can bring this realm of death back to life with fresh newcomers. Gathering all of us here just to revive this place. You've got some wild ideas, Wiz. Seeker, a person sitting not far away, commented. But next time, don't call, ping, all of us at once. It's childish. Do you have brain rot or something? Wiz, broken heart. Our server is toxic, full of schizos, emos, and racists who may or may not be joking, Koro said while looking at Unusual. He then smiled softly, but that's what makes it fun. So, Unusual, would you share the code? Faced with all the active members in the server he controls, Unusual paused for a moment as he deeply pondered the answer. Then, after a few moments, he opened his mouth. Then let us flood the gates once more. Those who want to join this chaotic amalgamation of inactive members, sudden schizophrenic conversations, and degenerate things. Unusual listed all the possible dangers present in his server as his eyes looked at the current active members surrounding him. Shall decide whether they'll stay or not. Bored readers are welcome to join in, and authors who want to share and promote their work can also come. Unusual said as he adjusted his thin-rimmed glasses while looking at the silhouette of another member named Paragon. Then share it. Finally, at the back of the dark room, the visage of Inchel smirked. Share the code, Unusual. Unleash chaos and watch as it burns and turns to ashes and eventually pathetically returns to what it previously was. A dead server. This server was passed down to you, so be a proper administrator. You alone have the sole full control of this place. So watch it grow and fall. Upon hearing this, Unusual paused for a moment before finally uttering the code for the passage to his server. Discord. com/invite/q7jnfk3ckp. Abandon all hope. All Yahoo enter here. Chapter 81, Clues and Puzzle. Here's your macchiato. Isaac offered Navia her cup of coffee, which had a thin layer of milk forming the shape of a flower. We can't possibly depart without a proper energizer, yet. Thank you. Navia took the cup and held it in her hand, cradling it gently. Her beautiful blue eyes then looked at Isaac. By the way, I recently watched the movie Lady Furina made during the film festival. It received a lot of positive reviews and even won first place. She added. She then chuckled lightly. I actually liked it too since it represented Poisson. As the main character of the movie, your presence there would have livened up the atmosphere more. I believe that what I did is sufficient enough, Isaac shook his head as he scoffed lightly. Moreover, since Spina di Rosala is also one of the main organizers of the movie, it was bound to receive praise. You have a way with your words, Isaac. Navia smiled lightly as she received Isaac's praise. She then shook her head while smiling, but let's stop the praises here. I have this feeling that we'd just be deflecting each other's praises. I agree. Sitting down on his stool behind the counter, Isaac took his cup of espresso. He then looked at her before uttering, then let's change the subject about your commission. Yes, it would be best if you have sufficient information regarding this matter, Navia said as she cradled the cup in her hand. She then asked him, what do you want to know? Well, first of all, how did you even find the traces of the masked clown and the painting he stole? Isaac, playing along with Navia, put on his acting and looked at her with a curious expression. That's an easy question. She nodded her head as she smiled. She then started explaining, recently, the local gangs and mafias in Fontaine have undergone tremendous changes. As an investigator, I trust you already knew this. So I've heard, Isaac, still acting, habitually put his hand on his chin and grasped it. I heard that a great change happened in the inner circles of these organizations' leadership. Upon hearing Isaac's response, Navia nodded her head with satisfaction. Indeed, that's exactly what we heard too. Apparently, a new organization has risen up and started bringing other organizations under its chain of command, she explained as she recounted the details from the top of her mind. This new organization is very systematic and knows how to avoid the eyes of the public, and to some extension, the law. Although, ever since it appeared, the amount of criminal activities in Fontaine sharply dropped. She said before her face started showing an expression of disgust. However, the synth trade only grew stronger. What a terrible organization! Isaac shook his head as he also showed an expression of contempt. Forgive me, but this is necessary. However, deep within, Isaac was apologizing to her. I did my best to limit the violence as much as possible. But the synth. That's just a temporary measure to counteract the balance. After all, there can't be no absolute goodness in this world. That's right. Isaac, who had been actively hunting down these gangs and mafias as Gehrman for the past week, was none other than the leader of this new organization. With his Gehrman persona, he raided bases, factories, and even mansions of nobles to find crime lords and bring them under his command. It wasn't quite hard as he already had a large organization from Marseille to help him in his raids. As such, Isaac believed that he already taken control of the vast majority of the crime rings in Fontaine. With his one command, Marcel, who was the figurehead of the organization, would immediately deploy the whole organization to do Isaac's bidding. However, all of them are none the wiser that all of them are just but bargaining chips for his grand plan. After all, only by casting away reason can one truly gamble. Isaac then shook his head before looking back at Navia. He then spoke, please continue, Miss Navia. Navia nodded her head and continued. When Spina di Rosala received information regarding this organization, we immediately sent a team to gather more information about it, me included. We first went to Fleuversendra for information, and that's where we got our first major clue. She said before pausing and taking a sip of her macchiato coffee. After sipping, she continued. An informant there said that he witnessed two people, clad in dark clothing on a rainy night, go to Arlecchino's forest while carrying what seemed like a canvas painting. Another informant said that those two people works for the new organization, and that this informant speculates that they're doing a secret work directly from the leader, but this is not proven yet. She added while curling her forefinger and resting it on her chin as she contemplated. We went around more, but didn't get any more clues other than the painting. Those two informants. They must be the two informants I hired. Isaac remembered a detail he left behind as he internally smirked. Looks like they did their job pretty well. Isaac originally wanted to give the painting away if some random person manages to find it using the clues he left behind, but since Navia was the first person to find the clues, he couldn't help but be curious of how she'd find the painting in the end. The petty thing I did managed to come back and become an interesting thing. How fun! Isaac then curled up a smile. If that's the case, then why didn't you investigate it with the rest of the Spina? They would have been much better than someone like me. Well, if you know someone who had been a god's assistant and helped her investigate for quite some time and showed positive results. Navia smirked softly as she started mentioning what Isaac had done. Then I'm pretty sure one would be so tempted enough to seek their help, would it not? Clever girl. Isaac chuckled lightly as he heard her words. He then stood up before speaking, well, I guess I'll take that reason for now. Before we head out, Miss Navia, may I change clothes? Isaac said as he pointed at the kitchen door. I have this habit of changing my clothes appropriate to the situation. I actually noticed that whenever you came by the set, Navia commented as she held her cup of coffee next to her lips. You never go anywhere wearing anything casual. But alas, this is the nation of Hydro where, like water, one's own visage must reflect a good look. Isaac replied with an amused tone. Haha, I won't deny that, she said as she rested her face on her palm. I bet my friend who's in the fashion business would like you. Kyrie. Remembering that seamstress, Isaac smiled wryly. He then replied to Navia, yeah? I'll look forward to that. Anywho, I'll be back in a minute. And with that, Isaac left, leaving Navia alone with her cup of coffee. Since it was still morning, the cafe does not yet have any customers other than Navia. As she looked at the door which Isaac had vanished to, a thought formed in her head. I wonder what he'd wear. It didn't take too long for Isaac to change his clothes. In fact, it had only been a few minutes. I'm back, Isaac's words were then heard by Navia. He then continued, I'm all set, Miss Navia. Navia, who was watching the television hanging on top of the counter, looked back to Isaac and noticed his new attire. Oh? That's... Upon seeing his new set of clothes, a curious expression appeared on her face. Unexpectedly fashionable. Isaac, wearing a black long-sleeved button-up shirt, coupled with grey pants and a pair of gloves, smirked at Navia. It may look impractical, but this attire is actually quite flexible. Isaac explained himself while pointing at his pockets and the shoulder holster he had. Blending practicality with aesthetic. Indeed, you and my friend would definitely get along. Navia muttered to herself as she looked around Isaac's new clothes. After checking him out a bit, she then shook her head. Anyways, have you gotten everything you need? Yup. I have my gun and dendrovision in my person for self-defense. Isaac nodded his head. He then returned the question. And you? I have everything here, Navia smiled with pride as she placed her parasol on her shoulder. This parasol contains all of what I need. Hearing this, Isaac smirked and said, oh my, it seems that I'm not only one that prefers practical aesthetics. You're just like me for real. He said. For real? She replied. For real, for real. He nodded his head. He then immediately changed the subject before he says more brain-rot terms. Anywho, shall we get going? Of course. She nodded her head at Isaac's question. She then got off from her seat and stood in front of Isaac. If there's nothing else, then let's go. Watching Navia walk away with a lively expression, Isaac smiled softly, finding it amusing. Another sense of déjà vu. The two of them were just about to leave the cafe, when suddenly, they heard a distant sound. Boom. What followed soon after this sound was the sound of rain hitting the ground, gradually getting stronger. Not long after this, more thunderous sounds were heard outside of the cafe, bringing forth more rain. Isaac and Navia, who were just about to leave the cafe, both looked at the sky and saw the dark clouds covering the sky. It's raining. Holding her hand out, Navia felt the sensation of the rain drop to her hand. This is gonna make our trip a tad bit more inconvenient. Inconvenient? I don't think so. Beside her, Isaac shook his head as he smiled softly. He then walked past Navia and stood outside the cafe. Hey! You'll get wet. Seeing Isaac stand in outside, Navia warned him as she pulled out her parasol to cover him. Although it might get you wet, I believe that rain itself is not that bad, Isaac, who was beneath the edge of the roof, and was thus saved from the rain's water, continued speaking calmly. Rain is inherently good, and as is the nation of Hydro, we ought to appreciate it more. Did you know, Miss Navia? Isaac then turned his head and looked at Navia beside him, who was sharing her black and yellow parasol with him. With his warm amber eyes looking at her, he spoke. God is in the rain. God is in the rain. Hearing Isaac's cryptic words, Navia showed a confused expression. What do you mean? Isaac, instead of answering, merely smiled enigmatically as he looked at the rain pouring. Navia, confused by his words, also looked at the rain for a moment, to see what he was trying to say. For a moment, the two didn't utter a word, and merely shared a moment of tranquility. Chapter 82, Oil, Water, and Something Else 1. Isaac and Navia both took the aquabus to Arlecchino's forest, and, although it was raining continuously, it didn't hinder the two one bit. It's still raining. Getting off the aquabus with an umbrella, Isaac made a comment while putting his hand out to feel the rain. Don't you find this odd, Miss Navia? I find it odd too. The sky was clear as day just this morning, then it immediately turned dark like this, she said as she too got off the aquabus with her parasol. Working with a lot of manpower in this weather condition would be tough. It's good that I followed through with my plan. It's currently autumn, so the rainy season should be over in Fontaine. Isaac thought, but soon immediately drew a speculation. He conjured up a wry expression as he thought of one of the possible explanations. Well, there is a hydro sovereign that can make the skies rain whenever he gets upset. So, yeah, this might be Nouvelette's doing. The dirt roads leading to the location you provided are gonna be problematic, Miss Navia. Looking at the horizon where only dark clouds could he perceived, Isaac immediately knew that their journey would not be easy. Should we perhaps wait until the rain stops? Navia observed the environment for a moment before shaking her head, followed by a soft sigh. There's no need. We can still travel with this weather. As long as you're fine with it, Isaac shrugged his shoulders and didn't complain. However, he couldn't help but face the sky and mutter something under his breath, but this rain. Che real is Santa. Did you say something, Isaac? Hearing a faint sound come from Isaac, Navia turned her head and looked back at him. Just talking to myself. Isaac shook his head before walking up to her with his umbrella. I was just admiring the ambience of the rain, that's all. Well, all right. Navia agreed with Isaac at first, however, her curiosity remained unsatisfied. She then made a comment while the two of them walked. Still, how could you ever find the time to admire ambience out here in the public, even more so at a time like this? How could I not? Following beside her, Isaac spoke with an amused expression. I could admire anything at any given moment. There's no limitation to beauty and admiration to it. Beauty? You're calling this damp weather beautiful? Navia rolled her eyes as she conjured a wry smile. Her pristine blue eyes then looked at Isaac's figure beside her. Can one truly appreciate the beauty of something that others may not perceive as beautiful? Upon hearing this question, Isaac paused in silence for a few moments before giving his answer. And what of it? Others may not agree to what I see as beautiful, but to me, that doesn't matter much. I admire what I want to admire. All right. I get your point, but consider this. Finding their conversation interesting, Navia continued to entertain Isaac with her curious questions. What if you held a rose? It might look, smell, and feel good, but beneath it are thorns that would hurt you if you're not careful. True to her family's motif, she made a reference to a flower, a rose. Would you still find it beautiful? As the pair walked through the rain side by side, silence enveloped for a few moments before it was broken by Isaac's words. Do you know that saying, Miss Navia? That beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Isaac, smiling enigmatically, said while looking out at the far distance. I believe in that saying very much. That's because I choose to believe what is beautiful and what's not. A thorny rose, you say? I'll still compliment it. He added. Because, ultimately, those thorns are part of that rose as such, they too are beautiful. Pièce vol. He muttered to himself while looking at Navia. He then shook his head as he wore a wry smile. Upon hearing Isaac's answer, Navia chuckled lightly before speaking. Must you always add a touch of romanticism to your words? I say that you have a much better tongue than bards. How else would I express my admire for beauty? Isaac shrugged his shoulders as he lightly chuckled too. He then looked back at what he said and thought with introspection. I might as well become a redhead knight hell-bent on admiring beauty if I keep this up. The two of them continued to talk amongst themselves, discussing various topics. However, their conversation soon ended when they reached the top of a set of stairs. Hold on, this is the turning point. Isaac said as he stopped Navia on her tracks. He then looked around the road they were at before muttering something to himself, Dobbiamo fare una deviazione. He then looked back at Navia before speaking again. If we want to get to the location you provided, we need to walk. There. Isaac then pointed at a hill with his finger before looking back at Navia beside him. Are you fine with that, Navia? It's all fine by me. She nodded her head upon receiving Isaac's words. However, she soon changed her expression to a cheeky smirk. More than that. You've been speaking a lot of Remurian for a while now. Navia pointed out her findings as she smirked at Isaac. I wasn't sure at first. But now I'm certain. Oops, I was caught. Smirking back at her, Isaac lightly laughed as he turned around. He started explaining, I was just doing it for fun. Took you long enough to notice. Also. Remurian. Remembering that ancient Remuria was essentially the ancient Roman Empire equivalent in this world, Isaac felt that it fits the overall context. I didn't even know that. I was just doing it for the shits and giggles. The more you know. Hehe, just to let you know, I'm quite well versed in Remurian myself. She said as she went past Isaac. However, she soon turned around and winked at him with a cheeky smile. Pense vi de poter lo nascondere me. Non va bene, amico mio. Devi essere più onesto. Oh no. What have I done? Isaac, upon hearing her proudly talk, could only conjure up a wry smile as he started to realize what he had done. She seems to love speaking this way though. Albeit I don't mind it. Mio dio, you're very good at it. Chuckling wryly, Isaac walked up to her with his umbrella while shaking his head. Of course. Me and my father would always practice this when I was child. She said with a soft smile as if remembering a distant memory. +5. That's nice. Isaac commented with a warm smile, seeing her change in demeanor. Shortly after their short conversation, the two of them went off-road and started climbing a hill that would lead them to the location Navia provided. It was quite far, but since they were at a hill, they were confident that they'd get a vantage point. Since it was still raining and the environment was muddy, Isaac paid close attention to their surroundings and Navia to prevent any kind of accidents such as slipping. Fortunately, no such things happened and the two of them reached the top of the hill. Phew, that's it. Still holding on tightly to her parasol, Navia looked at the distance and nodded her head in confirmation. That's it, that's the location of the painting. The weeping willow of the lake. In the distance, a massive weeping willow tree atop a large boulder could be seen. Although the rain was limiting the view, its presence was quite prominent and was hard to miss. The looming clouds in the horizon blocked off all the sunlight that could possibly permeate through its veil, drowning the land beneath it with its darkness. Even then, the soothing rain coupled with the howling winds coming from the mountains contradicted this phenomenon. This otherwise inconvenient weather was, for better or worse, soothing. The weeping willow, hey. Looking at the distance, Isaac, who was holding his umbrella, commented. Do people still go there? Some daring hikers and adventurers do, she said as she stood beside him, also surveying the area. Though, there shouldn't be any people present around this time. Well, I expected that much, at least. Isaac shrugged his shoulders. He then took out his revolver and made sure all the bullets in its brass canister were present. Let's be careful. Hydro-idolins might be present nearby as well as some rift hounds. How'd you know that? Turning her head to Isaac, she curiously asked him. I won't be an investigator if I haven't at least gathered information beforehand. He replied as he rolled his eyes at her with a wry smirk. Leading the way, he continued, come on then. Isaac was just about to lead the way, when suddenly, a flash went past his eye that caught him off guard. Hey! Race you there! Navia, who, despite carrying her parasol, ran quite fast. With a mischievous expression, she looked at Isaac. The last one is a rotten egg. But it's raining, how? Isaac, looking at her get further from him, commented with a wry expression. Looking at the way she ran, he made a confused expression. How is she not slipping? Isaac wanted to entertain this thought more, but upon seeing Navia go down the hill at astonishing speed, his inner competitiveness couldn't help but he lit up. Well, if that's how you want to play. Shaking his head, Isaac let out a soft sigh before smirking. Then so be it. Meanwhile, Navia, who was running at an adequately fast speed down the hill, miraculously was able to not trip and fall. Of course, this was but one of the many skills she developed as the head of the Spina di Rosella. No matter the adversity, she must have a vast array of trump cards to use at any given moment. Her lush blonde hair fluttered in the air as the wind went past her, and, because she was wearing a compact suit made for outdoor hiking, she didn't have to worry about getting mud all over her. Is Isaac lagging behind? Sensing no one behind her, Navia turned around to see Isaac and to rouse up his competitiveness. "What's wrong, Isaac?" Couldn't keep up. However, when she turned around, she suddenly saw Isaac's figure running up to her. What surprised her was that he was actually catching up. "Wait, what? Hey! Hold on! How are you able to do that?" Seeing Isaac not tripping in all the slippery mud, Navia couldn't help but shout at him as she saw him rapidly approaching her like a train. "Hat, my genius is! It's almost terrifying." Isaac smirked as he gradually got closer and closer behind Navia. "You!" Finally, the moment Isaac got closer to her, Navia was able to understand how he was able to stay upright. She then called him out, "You're using your vision." Beneath Isaac's feet, small but sharp spike-like roots were present. Each time Isaac's foot landed, the roots would extend and plant themselves in the ground, giving him traction. They would then retract and the process repeats itself. With their help, Isaac was able to run without having to worry about falling down. "That's right. Isaac has made. This is the power of track spike shoes," he said proudly as he slowly caught up to her. "That's cheating!" Navia shouted. However, she didn't slow down one bit and instead kept running to outrun Isaac, who was chasing her like a bull. "Says who?" he replied while breathing heavily as he ran. "This is an impromptu challenge. Even so, using a vision is still cheating. Skill issue." "What?" As Navia and Isaac ran down the hill shouting at each other while also having fun, in the far distance, two figures also carrying umbrellas could be seen observing them. One was a tall figure while the other was petite. "Is that not?" The tall figure, having observed Isaac's shenanigans, was just about to point him out when he noticed the petite person next to him. "That? What is Isaac doing with her?" the other figure said while keeping an eye on Isaac and Navia. "Why? Is he with her?" The petite figure's voice deepened solemnly. Whether it's from frustration, irritation, anger, or disappointment was unknown. The other tall figure remained silent, and merely watched with impartiality. Chapter 83, Oil, Water, and Something Else Too. Last night, after Furina bid farewell to Isaac and returned to Palais Mermonia, she entered Nouvelette's office to discuss a matter with him. "I'm here. What is it that you want to discuss so badly?" After closing the doors behind her, Furina slowly walked over to Nouvelette with a bored expression. "I was supposed to have a delicious chicken confit tonight. So there better be a good reason as to why you called me. I don't believe you were the type of person to overly indulge yourself in dishes." Nouvelette, who was compiling a stack of paperwork on his desk, glared at Furina with his sharp eyes as he commented on her behavior. "Or has your recent involvement with your cherished assistant affected you so much? Hey, don't bring Isaac into this." Upon hearing Nouvelette's suspicious remark, Furina turned her head and looked at him while crossing her arms. "What makes you think he can alter my behavior?" Nouvelette stared at her for a moment before putting away his pile of paperworks. He then rested his arm on the desk in front of him and looked at her once more before opening his mouth. "Well, taking into account what the two of you had been doing behind everyone's backs, I have a decent guess. Lady Furina. What you have been doing lately has been too unfit for the role of Archon of Fontaine," he blatantly said to her without sugarcoating anything. His sharp, calm eyes then glared at her heterochromatic eyes. "You should know very well about the serious consequences if word of this gets out, Lady Furina." Furina, upon hearing Nouvelette's words, couldn't help but widen her eyes in bafflement. She then clenched her fist in response. You investigated me? And knew? Why?" Still looking at her solemnly, Nouvelette's face stern expression said everything about the gravity of the situation. "Have you not also been investigating him before? Whatever happened to that? What changed your suspicion of him?" Furina became silent for a moment and thought of retorting him, but when she tried to speak, she found no words that could support her. That's... In retrospect, what Nouvelette had said was indeed true. She did have suspicions about Isaac and even wanted to figure out the truth, but he still managed to slip past her grit. Faced with Furina's silence, Nouvelette's solemn face remained unchanged as if he had expected this outcome. With the same solemn voice, he said, "You've realized it too, haven't you? That the assistant you call Isaac is related or might even be the most controversial criminal in Fontaine currently. That's why you started the whole investigation in the first place." Nouvelette, being the Chief Justice of Fontaine, as well as the current head of the Marechaussee Phantom, has more than one way of finding out information he desired. Truth be told, Neuvillette had never taken his eyes off Isaac since he had saved Furina. Although the latter always managed to act clueless and well in front of the agents that the former planted around him, his real actions still couldn't get through Neuvillette's keen intuition and judgment. Not only does Neuvillette know that Furina frequently visits Isaac, but he also knows about Isaac's strange habits and odd customers. Lady Furina, you can still salvage this situation. Seeing Furina stay silent and not try to talk back to him, Neuvillette decided to keep speaking. Regarding this, I've called you today to discuss another matter. My informants have told me that they found the Dame d'Eau's which was stolen months ago. Neuvillette said before standing up and pulling out a paper from the stack of paperwork in his desk. The very same painting that sparked a nationwide controversy questioning Fontaine's capabilities. Neuvillette then placed the paper in front of Furina where it showed a certain location and a few details about the painting. After placing the paper down, Neuvillette walked over by Furina's side and told her solemnly. Lady Furina, if you want to settle the nation's unrest and uncover a major breakthrough to this case, then I suggest you to see it for yourself. Faced with Neuvillette's excellent reasoning, a skill he had made as the Chief Justice, Furina wasn't able to refute any of his claims. She took the paper and read it in silence for a few moments before putting it back down. Clenching her fist, she looked at him with her heterochromatic eyes before speaking. The painting's location, is your source reliable? Neuvillette remained silent for a moment before opening his mouth and uttering a response. This investigation was personally overseen by me, so you can be assured that the reliability of this is reasonable. Although we still don't know why that masked clown placed that painting there, considering what he and that mysterious visitor did in Poisson. Neuvillette placed his hands behind his waist and started explaining. Then this aligns well with their modus operandi. The world and the tower. Those are the only tarot cards found to be related to the masked clown and the mysterious visitor in Poisson. He continued as he sighed. It's obvious that this sort of organization consisting of tarot card code names are into performances, and would most likely do this for a reason. Hold on, the tower. Furina, unaware of the other person Neuvillette mentioned, looked at him with exasperation. Also, that tarot organization. Isn't that? Indeed. It was the theory Isaac mailed to us, his speculation about an organization full of actors using tarot cards as their code names. I decided to adopt this theory. Neuvillette nodded his head as he recalled the first time Isaac reached out to Palais Mermonia. As for the tower, he was an enigmatic individual who once delivered dead bodies inside a gift box to Poisson one evening. His tarot card was inside the gift box. If you've already known this, then why didn't you tell me? Furina yelled at him with irritation. However, despite this, she still retained her elegance. This was a major clue. Neuvillette looked at her for a moment as if he was contemplating something before opening his mouth. Then would not this be a great opportunity to find it out for yourself? That's... Faced with this, Furina instantly got silent as she turned her head away from him, her mind in turmoil of who to believe. As for Neuvillette, his impartial eyes remained constant, unyielding to Furina's open emotions. He remained upright, standing before her as if silently judging her. A few moments of silence would pass by with only the sound of the clock ticking acting as the only source of sound in this quiet space. The two, remaining in silent contemplation, never broke it. However, this changed when Furina turned her head and looked at Neuvillette directly in the eyes. I'll do it, she declared, her heterochromatic eyes full of determination. But I have one condition. Please speak. He gently nodded his head and agreed to her compliance. Although he was impartially strict, he too was understanding. Furina, after pondering for a second, shook her head and opened her mouth, her voice full of dignified determination. Accompany me there. Neuvillette, upon hearing this, almost let go of the cane he was holding. He then looked at her with disbelief in his face. I beg your pardon. The next morning. Neuvillette, please lighten up. Furina, looking at the Chief Justice beside her, commented with an annoyed tone. On the other hand, Neuvillette remained silent as he merely took out his umbrella. A good sunny day. Immediately turned bad. Furina placed her one hand on her hip and shook her head. Still looking at Neuvillette beside her, she continued, what made you upset now? Well, if it isn't for a certain individual, this would not have happened. Neuvillette replied coldly, as if he was not interested in speaking with Furina. You know very well how busy my work is, yet you still had the idea to drag me out with you. Humph, this is only because I wanted to show you. Furina paused for a moment as if thinking of something for a moment before continuing. I wanted to share the results with you to prove whether Isaac truly is connected to everything. Very well. He responded while shaking his head. However, this will not happen again. Understood. Yet, I got it. Furina rolled her eyes as she too opened her umbrella. Looking at him, she said, if there's nothing else then let's go. With that said, the Chief Justice and the Hydro Archon of Fontaine both set off whilst wearing their respective disguises to not stand out. With the help of the Melusine's personnel, Neuvillette trusts they didn't get much hindrance during their travel and arrived at the Weeping Willow of the lake relatively fast. While walking, Furina sensed something and extended her hand out of the umbrella. The rain is getting weaker. She then turned her head to the person next to her, Neuvillette. With a sly smirk, she teased him. Are you feeling better now, my dear Ihudex? I am merely treating this as leisurely work. He replied as he looked at the distance, watching the gentle rain fall down. Watching each raindrop fall from the tip of his umbrella, Neuvillette made a comment. Rain is, intrinsically serene and induces tranquility, such as my eternal fascination for it. Is that not just because you're the Hydro Dragon? Furina crossed her arms and inquired about his comment. Oh Hydro Dragon, would you also love hot molten lava if you were the Pyro Dragon? Such crude humor. Hearing Furina's sarcastic joke, Neuvillette shut his eyes as he looked away from her. Where did you learn such a thing? A certain someone has rubbed off on me. She replied as she thought of Isaac, who always has something sarcastic present in his mind that he may or may not tell her. Moreover, it's fun to do when I'm not around other people. So he did alter your behavior. Neuvillette said after hearing Furina's response. You admit it yourself just now. This is different. She puffed up her cheeks in response and turned around, ignoring Neuvillette. Honestly, Neuvillette, not everything that's changed about me is caused by Isaac. Some of them. Furina was just about to continue with her banter with Neuvillette, when suddenly, she heard a distant voice coming from near the lake. My genius is. It's almost terrifying. That's cheating. Skill issue. Hearing distant shouting, both Neuvillette and Furina looked at the direction of the sound, only to see two figures racing down a hill as though they were children playing. Is that not? Neuvillette immediately recognized who the man was and was just about to mention who he is, when suddenly, he was interrupted. That? Why? Is he with her? A deep, foreboding tone escaped Furina's mouth, hinting disbelief and a bit of frustration. Just a moment ago, Furina and Neuvillette were having their usual casual banters, but now, the latter had completely changed. Looking at Furina, whose eyes were wide open as if devoid of any life, Neuvillette remained silent for a few moments before opening his mouth. You seem upset. What? Upset? Me? Haha. Furina, who heard Neuvillette's words, turned her head to him and chortled wryly. She then looked at him with an irritated stare. I'm just wondering what my dear assistant Isaac is doing with someone else. If I remember correctly, Isaac's other job is a private investigator, Neuvillette, holding his umbrella, said. He might have been hired for something. Much like what you did. I know that. Furina said as she continued to look at Isaac and Navia in the distance. It's just. Why didn't he tell me? Upon hearing her response, Neuvillette looked at her with a curious gaze and asked a question, and why would he tell that to you? Furina remained silent for a few moments before she turned her head and looked back at Neuvillette. With a cold stale smile and deep eyes devoid of any positive emotions, she laughed at Neuvillette's question. Haha, why wouldn't he? We're the best of friends, after all. She said as she continued smiling sweetly with no emotion, only using a fake mask. Shouldn't I constantly be kept in touch with him and be there to advise him on his choices? Is that truly what you think? Looking at Furina's emotionless smile, Neuvillette solemnly spoke to her. I'm sure Isaac already knows how to decide for himself. Hee, of course. Taking her gaze off Neuvillette, Furina looked back at the distance and at Isaac's figure. Her smile deepened while a faint tinge of red spread across her face as she continued to speak, however. No other advisor is better than the god of justice herself, after all, and that's me, Furina de Fontaine. I'm the only qualified person that he should solely rely on, no one else. Chapter 84, Oil, Water, and Something Else 3. Is that really it? Navia asked Isaac as she and him hid behind a boulder, looking at something in the distance. It should be. Behind her, Isaac nodded his head in response. I mean, there shouldn't be any other paintings similar to the Dame d'O's, right? I know that, but still. Still looking at the distance, Navia wore a wry expression as she let out a soft sigh. Isn't this a bit too? How should I put it? Welcoming. At the distance, beneath the weeping willow of the lake, a soul painting was present surrounded by its roots. There were no traps nor any kind of obstacles found anywhere around it. It was as if it was left there with not much thought. There's no ambush waiting for us if we reached out for it, would there? She asked once more as she looked around the surrounding area. I doubt it. No one would sit through the rain for an indefinite amount of time just waiting for someone to claim the painting. Isaac, still acting, suggested. Albeit, he was also subtly telling the truth. In truth, I just didn't care that much. He thought to himself while observing Navia's actions. I just wanted to give the darn painting away. Though, to be fair, adding a sort of perilous journey to reach it would have been a great idea. Shaking his head, Isaac dismissed those thoughts and returned to the matter at hand. Well, there doesn't seem to be anyone around. Standing up, Isaac went past Navia and started walking towards the center of the lake. So I say we take the painting now. Well, I guess you're right. After looking around, Navia couldn't help but agree with Isaac and followed behind him. Why do you think that clown left this painting here of all places? As they walked, she couldn't help but get curious about the overall situation. He could have sold this somewhere for a lot of mora. If this is what the clown wanted to do from the start, then why even bother stealing it in the first place? I agree, it's ludicrous. Isaac, having formed a small smile, nodded at her comments. Internally, however, he was lampooning. I'm sorry, okay? It was the system's mission. Moreover, I didn't have the balls at that time to sell this to anyone. The painting would only bring unnecessary trouble to Isaac. If he placed it in his cafe, even secretly, someone might still find it. If he sold it, then there would be a great chance that he'd get exposed, and get sent to the depths of the fortress of Meropid where he'd eternally serve Ryo tea. As such, before the ticking time bomb explodes, Isaac just planned to give the painting away in a random location. Still, the clown might have other agendas, and just chose to disregard this painting. He said to her with a light tone. It's as you said, stealing this painting was meaningless for him to do. This is the problem with criminals like these, you just can't seem to figure out their true intentions. Navia chuckled wryly, trying to lighten up the conversation. And that's what sets them apart from us good law-abiding citizens of Fontaine. The most wanted criminal of Fontaine, Isaac said. Indeed. We're different from them. We don't dabble in barbaric actions. The head of the Spina di Rosella that accepts any kind of commissions, Navia, nodded her head. Isaac nodded his head as he turned and looked at Navia beside him. So what are you gonna do with the painting? I think I'd return it to Palam Ermonia. Navia crossed her arms and said. Returning it would give the Spina quite a hefty compensation, after all. Of course, I'd still share some spoils with you. She then looked back at Isaac and winked at him. She paused for a moment before saying with a light smile, partner. Oh my, does that title mean I'd be used by the Spina again in the future? Isaac scoffed lightly. If so, then my doors are always open. Spoken like a true merchant forever seeking business and profit. Navia rolled her eyes upon hearing Isaac's reply. The two continued to talk to each other as they walked towards the center of the lake. It didn't take long, and soon, they found themselves standing before the painting under the tree. Looking at the painting of Furina, Isaac's warm amber eyes softened as he couldn't help but compliment it. What a truly stunning piece of art! Is that compliment for the painting or for Lady Furina, I wonder? Upon hearing Isaac's compliment, Navia smiled softly at him. Why can't it be both? Isaac shrugged his shoulders before shooting a glance back at her. Remember what we talked about earlier? About beauty? Well. Isaac then raised his hand and opened his palm before the painting. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And this painting in my eyes. The muse and the art are both beautiful. Hearing Isaac's complimenting words, Navia spoke out her mind. There you go saying romantic things again. I can't even tell if you're just an adamant worshipper of Lady Furina or... She paused for a moment before continuing. Or you genuinely feel something for her. Guess. Choosing to be enigmatic, Isaac chuckled wryly at her words. What a charlatan you are. Navia rolled her eyes as she too chuckled lightly. As the two continued to chat, Isaac, who was paying attention to their surroundings, suddenly heard rustling from a certain direction. Navia, who was also speaking with Isaac, noticed the sound too and looked at the direction he was looking at. You heard that, right? Pulling out his silver revolver, Isaac pulled the hammer back and rested his finger on the trigger. Loud and clear. Putting down her parasol, Navia pulled a lever, and it immediately transformed into a gunbrella. As the two aimed at the bushes not far away where they heard the noise, the perpetrator finally revealed itself. Grr. Howl. Oh. That's. Looking at its appearance, Isaac lifted his gun and aimed it at the creature. A rift hound, hey. A floating wolf-like creature emerging from the void. Its appearance alone invoked the feeling of terror and corruption. 5 of them too. Also aiming her gunbrella at the monsters that just emerged, Navia added. These things are ferocious even in small numbers. Be careful, Isaac. Got it. He replied as he nodded his head. Isaac was just about to fire the first shot at the rift hounds, when suddenly, something interrupted him. Humph. Whimper. Grr. Awoo. In an instant, the 5 rift hounds were enveloped in a gush of water so strong that it tore through their hide and obliterated them in an instant. By the time the gush of water disappeared, the rift hounds present were no longer there. It was as if they had been thoroughly cleansed from the face of the earth. Hey! Seeing this, both Isaac and Navia looked dumbfounded for a moment, not knowing what happened. That! What was that just now? Turning off her gunbrella, Navia turned her head to the source of the water. Upon seeing where the water came from, however, did her eyes widen. Wait! Isn't that Monsieur Nouvelette? Isaac, upon seeing who it was, questioned in surprise. Nouvelette, who was carrying an elegant umbrella on one hand and a cane on the other, walked over to Isaac and Navia. Did the 2 of you get hurt? He asked gently and solemnly once he approached the 2 of them. No, we're fine. Looking at herself and Isaac's current condition, Navia shook her head. She then continued speaking with a somewhat awkward tone. On the contrary, we're doing excellent. Thank you for asking. That's wonderful to hear, Miss Navia. Looking at her appearance, Nouvelette observed her for a moment and immediately recognized her. He then turned his head and looked at the person behind her. As for you, Mr. Isaac. I'm doing F. Before Isaac could continue his words, however, he was suddenly interrupted. Puh! In an instant, someone jumped into him and clung onto him, causing him to be disoriented in balance. Déjà vu. He thought to himself upon feeling the sensation of what just happened. If I'm not wrong, this is... Turning his head and looking at who jumped onto him, sure enough, Isaac guessed it right. Furina. You can't keep doing that. Hugging his neck from behind, Furina clung to Isaac and hugged him tightly, not letting him move an inch. My dear ISA. Assistant Isaac. What are you doing here? Still hugging him tightly, Furina started a conversation as if nothing had happened. She then brought her face closer to his shoulder and looked at him. Have you eaten today? I have. Feeling Furina's entire body cling unto him, Isaac's face immediately started showing faint red hues. He then quickly tried to dismiss her. Furina, can you please get off me? Why should I? Might I remind you that I am your god? She brought her face closer to his shoulder before looking at him in the eye. Should I not have this much rain at the very least? I know that, but... Isaac, struggling to deal with her right now, continued to argue. Someone is staring. Nouvelette and Navia, who were chatting just a moment ago, were now looking at Isaac and Furina. Navia, who was watching Isaac struggling to breathe due to Furina's hug, could only conjure a confused expression. Should I be asking questions? It's better to not bother. Beside her, Nouvelette shook his head as he silently sighed. Lady Furina right now is, just happy to see her assistant. Is that so? Navia has a feeling that that wasn't the case, but for now, she'll just have to accept that excuse. Furina, upon hearing Isaac's reason, showed a blank expression for a moment before letting go of him. You finally let go of me. Seriously, you've gotta stop. Isaac thought he was free from her control, only to find out how wrong he was. Whoa hey! Furina, who had gone down Isaac, walked over to his front and grabbed him by his shirt collar. The way she stood upright with a solemn expression showed how serious she was about it. I need to chat with you. Privately. She said before dragging Isaac's collar towards the boulder beneath the tree. With Navia and Nouvelette watching them, Furina dragged Isaac away. We'll be back soon. We're just gonna have a chat. Isaac waved his hand at Navia, indicating that he was doing all right. After being dragged away from Navia and Nouvellette, Isaac and Furina now had an alone time for their chat. Furina, can you let go of me now? Still being held by Furina, Isaac spoke to her. I'm sure this must be tiring for you too. Why? Isaac then heard her grumble something under her breath while not looking at him. Not hearing her clearly, Isaac leaned his head closer to her to better pick up her sound. Can you repeat that? Isaac, who leaned closer, was finally able to hear what she was saying. Why? Are you flirting with her? Furina turned her head and looked at Isaac. She had a somewhat upset expression and the light in her eyes was dim, as if she didn't have any energy. Isaac, who was suddenly accused, immediately retorted with bafflement. Flirting? Hold on, I was never flirting with anyone. You liar. You were flirting with Navia. Furina, however, didn't accept his excuse and berated him. You kept talking about romantic things and the two of you even had a good synergy going on. It's unfair. She continued as she started hitting Isaac's chest in frustration. Why would you flirt with another woman when? She paused for a moment before a single shed of tears ran down her face. When you have me. Furina. Upon hearing her complaint, Isaac couldn't help but feel a bit ashamed. Upon introspection, what Furina said was right, and he couldn't help but feel guilty. He then tried to explain himself, it wasn't my intention to flirt with her. I might have sounded like I was trying, but believe me. He then took her hands and held it firmly, not letting them go. Afterwards, Isaac wiped her tears and looked at her directly in the eyes before speaking. I would never intentionally hurt you. It was the truth. Never in a million years would Isaac think of hurting her, and only vows to make her live a serene happy life. Do you mean it? Looking up at Isaac, Furina's voice trembled. For 500 years. That is the first time I've heard such words. Hearing this, Isaac smiled softly before bringing himself closer to her. I mean it. If you don't believe it, then I'll just have to make you believe it. With that said, he took her one hand and kissed it while looking at her. Furina, seeing this, wiped her tears before speaking with a faint voice. You. I hate you, but... She then leaned closer and hugged Isaac once more. This time, it was much gentler. Isaac reciprocated and returned the hug, and the two embraced each other's heat beneath a tree under a rainy day. Then, with a faint, watery voice, Furina continued speaking. I don't want to lose you. Not now that you've shown me this feeling. Don't worry. I'll always be here for you. So don't cry anymore. He replied with a soft and gentle voice, soothing her worries away. Chapter 85, Oil, Water, and Something Else 4. Here. Don't cry, all right. Gently wiping off her tears from her face, Isaac softly smiled. You look much better when you're not crying. Are you implying that I don't look good when I am crying? Furina replied as she allowed Isaac to wipe her tears away while looking at him with piercing eyes. Currently, the two of them were sitting beneath a shade, hidden from the eyes of Navia and Nouvellette. The two of them sat down on the land beneath the shade of the weeping willow tree above, slightly shielding them from the rain. I didn't say that. At her question, Isaac smirked. I just prefer you smile more. That's all. Is that so? Looking directly at Isaac, Furina's mind wandered as she quietly observed him gently wiping her face. Isaac, who noticed her silently staring at him, tilted his head and curiously questioned her, Is something on my face? Nothing. But I'm curious. She mumbled, still locking in with Isaac. You have a beautiful shade of eyes. Yet they look lifeless. Why is that? Upon hearing her question, Isaac paused for a moment before chuckling lightly. He then took his hand off her and answered her question, I could ask the same to you. Why are your eyes heterochromatic? And why do they hold such an allure? Touché. Furina tilted her head back to the boulder behind them with a sigh. She then pointed at his face, I'm guessing it's a secret that you aren't ready to divulge yet. Something like that, yes. He shrugged his shoulders before also resting his back on the boulder behind them. Under the light rain pouring down from the skies of Fontaine, Isaac and Furina shared a moment of silence as they both watched the rain fall and assimilate to the ground. The smell of the earth, coupled with the rain, produced a petrichor smell that brought an unnatural sense of warmth to the two. Isaac and Furina sat side by side, just quietly witnessing the passage of time go by. Should we go back now? Opening his mouth, Isaac spoke with an unheard voice. Monsieur Nouvelette must have a lot on his plate, right? I bet he's a busy person. Don't worry. He applied for absence today in the court, so we don't have to worry about taking much of his time. Furina smirked smugly as she recalled the procedures they went through just so Nouvelette could go out. Oh my! To think he'd take a day off just to accompany you. Hearing this, Isaac also smirked slightly. This must have been an important occasion. Now that I think about it, why are you guys here? Suddenly realizing this, Isaac voiced out his curiosity. That's what I wanted to ask you, she said as she turned her head and looked at Isaac with a piercing gaze. Why were you and Navia even here? Did you find clues about the painting? Well, it went something like this. Isaac then proceeded to explain what Navia told him, and what led to their current situation. As Furina listened, her face became more and more flushed as she figured out the overall situation. And now we're here. Isaac finished explaining. He then looked at Furina beside him. Do you get it now? I get it. I overreacted. Furina replied with a faint sigh as she tilted her head forward. Still, your flowery words earlier. Humph. Witnessing the way she acts, Isaac observed her for a moment before smirking. He then leaned closer to her and teased her, why? Jealous. Why you? Seeing Isaac try and tease her with an obvious bait, Furina pushed him away. You're such a fool. She paused for a moment before tucking her legs together with her arms and hiding her face. She then finally mumbled a sentence under her breath as she hid her face. Of course I was. We already did that thing. Still hiding herself, Furina continued speaking. I'd obviously feel this way. Those moments we shared together mean a lot to me, you know. Hearing this, Isaac became silent for a moment before forming a soft smile. He then gently tapped her head with his finger. I get it. Furina felt Isaac's tap and lifted her head, looking back at him. She saw his gentle expression, and, for the first time ever, saw something different. His usual lifeless deep amber eyes, which always gave her a sense of uneasiness, now had a tinge of vibrant warm color. It was as if she was watching a sunset by the sea as she looked into his hazy eyes. Don't worry, he spoke, with his usual gentle tone, reassuring her of any worry. Leaving you would be the last thing on my mind. Isaac could never fully know Furina's heart nor her true essence. Nonetheless, his deep admiration for her actions as well as her sacrifice for the nation was something he could never replace. He knew how much she cried, and how much she had hoped for her cruel reality to stop and have a moment of respite. The endless theatrics and the show that never ends had utterly and depressingly crushed her mental fortitude many times. Yet she was but an actor that must continue to act the fool to fool others, and as such could only smile at the cruelty of fate. Furina, you might find this absurd but... he said as he slowly reached out his hand and held hers. I just feel like... you deserve a peaceful life. From one actor to another, I know how tiring it is to keep wearing our masks. As he intertwined their fingers together, Isaac looked at her directly and tilted his head to the side. But that doesn't mean we can't put our masks down once in a while. Hearing Isaac's words, Furina looked at him silence for a few moments. She contemplated deeply in her mind about his words, and what they possibly meant. After a while, a soft but brittle smile appeared on her face as she spoke. Putting down your mask. I can't do that. The nation must have a proper archon to rule over them. And I must be that proper archon. She added as she looked at her hand intertwined with Isaac. As for why? You don't need to tell me. Isaac quickly cut her off. He then took his gaze off her and looked at the horizon. You must have a reason for doing that. Like me, you too have a reason for wearing that mask. Isaac then slowly stood up, with Furina watching him. He inhaled and exhaled deeply. He then turned around and faced Furina who was huddled and extended his arm as he invited her. To us, the fools. Furina, who watched Isaac, fell silent. Watching his hand, various thoughts flooded her mind. Does he know about my true purpose? But Mirror Me hasn't said anything about the plan failing, so he must not have known about the plan. What is his secret? Is he really related or perhaps the clown? A peaceful life. In a short span of moments, many topics rose in her mind. Questions regarding Isaac were the most prominent, curiosity, suspicion and intrigue were the three most evident. Her eyes softened as she continued to ponder these thoughts in her mental space where she sat on a throne of lies. The fact that the plan is still ongoing despite me being this close to someone means. As she entertained this thought, she lifted her gaze and looked at Isaac. Not to mention that he knew about my act. That familiar, curly brown hair, his warm amber eyes, and his usual amiable expression was all she saw. Are you, finally my savior? 500 years. It was a long and arduous journey of keeping her burden to herself, not daring to get close to anyone in fear of failing her other self's grand plan. For hundreds of years, she never got close to anyone romantically because she feared any mistake. But now, looking at Isaac, who she got close to without risking the failure of their plan, Furina sensed something she was most familiar with. Tears. Without her knowing, a stream of tears ran down her face as she looked at Isaac's hand. Hey! Realizing this, Furina tried wiping her tears away, yet they still continued to run down. Sorry, I just... It's all right. Isaac's words of comfort reached her ears. He then bent down on one knee and wiped her tears off again. See? From one actor to another. We can put down our masks for a while. Heek. Hearing Isaac's words, Furina didn't hold it in anymore and immediately jumped up to him and hugged him as tightly as possible. It was as if a dam broke and a flood of emotions drowned her senses, leading her to appropriate it. Tud. There. It's all right. Isaac, who fell to the ground, didn't scold her. He instead only gently patted her back as she clung onto him tightly while silently sobbing. It's all right. Just let it all out. Sniffle. Sob. Heek, wah. Soft and quiet sobbing only emanated from Furina, who buried herself in Isaac's chest, muffling her cry with his shirt. Sometimes, we just need to slow down and take a break. Sitting down on the soil once more, Isaac gently whispered to her as he let her use his shirt for a while. And that's perfectly normal for everyone. Including you. And just like that, the two spent another silence under the weeping willow tree, disregarding Navia and Nouvellette, who were still waiting for them to come back. Isaac didn't care for this right now, however, and only provided comforting words for Furina, who was sobbing on his shirt. As for Furina, who finally found an outlet to pour out her hundreds of years' worth of frustration, continued to quietly cry. Something she didn't know was possible was right in front of her, and she wasn't willing to let it, or rather, him go. This too was a form of serenity, freedom from shackles. Are you fine now? Standing up, Isaac once again wiped Furina's face for her. Why yes. Furina, whose eyes were faintly red from crying, looked at Isaac, who was gently cleaning her with his handkerchief. I'm sorry for this unsightly behavior. That wasn't befitting of me. Don't worry about it, Isaac shook his head before smirking. He then made a joke, if it fancies you, I can even give you this shirt so it can truly become your handkerchief, haha. All right. I'll be expecting it. She nodded her head as she spoke softly while looking up at him. I don't want to bother you, so you can give it unwashed. Hey. However, contrary to his expectations, Furina boldly accepted his words. Are you sure? Yes. She reaffirmed as she nodded her head in confirmation. She then continued and tried to play it out normally. I'll be grateful for the gift. Is she thinking of something impure? Isaac shook his head as he felt his face heat up. No, now's not the time to think about that. Lock in, Isaac. Shall we go back now? After cleaning her face, Isaac suggested to Furina once more. I think it would become too suspicious if we still haven't come back. All right. Hearing his suggestion, Furina nodded her head. She then looked at him and gently knocked on his chest. But no words of anything that happened. All right. Also the shirt. Sure. He nodded his head. He then gestured with his body, ladies first. I'll be right behind you. So gentlemanly all of a sudden? Fine. Not finding anything strange with Isaac's words, Furina softly smiled as she agreed and walked in front of him. Unbeknownst to her, however, Isaac intentionally walked behind to do something. Looking at the painting right above the boulder, Isaac's mind raced as a thought popped up in his mind. He then took out something from the system storage and splashed it on the corner of the painting before putting it back. After doing this, Isaac caught up to Furina as if nothing happened. Chapter 86, Oil, Water, and Something Else 5. What took the two of you so long? Nouvellette spoke with a heavy tone. It was evident that he was upset at how long Furina and Isaac disappeared. "Forgive me, Monsieur Nouvelette. It's just that me and Lady Furina got a little too carried away in our conversation." Wearing a feeble look, Isaac wryly smiled as he quickly apologized. "I hope it wasn't much of an inconvenience for you." "No, it does not." Nouvelette shook his head with a solemn expression before looking at Furina beside Isaac. "Still, what did the two of you talk about for your conversation to last that long?" After saying this, Nouvelette's eyes darted at Furina as if trying to convey a message to her. As for Furina, she noticed his gaze and immediately knew what he meant by those words. Looking back at Isaac and Nouvelette, she pondered for a moment before speaking. With her usual confident tone, she uttered, "It's nothing much. Me and Isaac just discussed some matters regarding our film." "Is that all?" Nouvelette inquired, intending to find out more from her words. "Indeed. There is nothing else." Nouvelette stayed silent for a moment as if interrogating her inside his mind, his eyes sharp and narrowed at the two's expressions. Isaac and Furina, on the other hand, remained calm on the surface. Nouvelette might have an exceptional talent in discerning human emotions, but he was currently facing two master actors. Hiding their true intentions was as easy as breathing, if Isaac were to put it into words. After a while, however, Isaac finally broke the silence with his similarly usual confident tone. Monsieur Nouvelette? Are you all right? You've been awfully silent for a while now." Although a few seconds had only passed, it was as if an eternity had passed by in Isaac and Nouvelette's perception. To them, such little details were always needed and as such forced them to adjust their perception. As for Furina, she only saw the two of them look at each other for a few seconds and that was it. Awakened by Isaac's voice, Nouvelette lingered for a few more moments before shaking his head. "Forgive me for that incessant stare. That was rude of me. No worries. It happens to the best of us." Isaac shrugged his shoulders. He then looked around for a bit with his deep amber eyes and noticed something peculiar. A confused expression soon appeared on his face. "By the way, where's Navia?" he asked, genuinely concerned about his new business partner. Nouvelette shook his head as if he too was confused about the situation. He quickly followed up to Isaac's question. "Miss Navia has left not too long ago. We talked a bit about the discovery of the painting, however, she soon abruptly left. She merely said that there was still a lot of business she had to attend and gave her apologies to you, Isaac." After Nouvelette's explanation ended, Isaac fell into contemplation for a few moments. Looking at Nouvelette, he had a guess as to why she immediately left. She still doesn't like him, huh? Well, that figures. Isaac couldn't blame her. Knowing about her father's past, as well as the true revelations of the events behind his death, he had somewhat understood Navia's reluctance and enmity regarding Nouvelette. Releasing a soft sigh, he subtly shook his head with regret and uttered in the next moment. "Really? That's a shame. She and I did pretty well for our first partnership. I think I'll visit her once this is over." After he said this, however, an elbow suddenly rammed to his arm. It didn't hurt him too much, but it still stung. "Ow! What the?" Turning his head, he looked at Furina and saw her pouting expression as if telling him no. Accompanied by a silvery voice that she usually never does as if copying Isaac's demeanor, she spoke. "Ah, but Isaac, do we not have other pressing matters? Remember." If there was one thing Isaac was good at, it was sensing the meaning between lines. Instantly, he knew what she meant. "Why yet? Yet? You're right. It's that thing, right? Isaac doesn't know what he's talking about." "Yes, it's that thing." Furina, on the other hand, smiled cheerfully upon hearing his response. "I see." Seeing her happy face, Isaac's mental fortitude collapsed and gave in to Furina's desires. "Ah, those contribution points, the reward." Remembering the rewards for retrieving the painting, Isaac grimaced with regret. Turning his head back to Nouvelette, he conjured a wry smile and said with a hesitant tone. "Well, I guess I won't be able to meet up and discuss with Navia about my contribution for discovering the painting. A pity." Notice the lines. He internally begged Nouvelette to notice his intentions. Nouvelette, on the other hand, stared at him for a moment before shaking his head. "You needn't worry. Navia had already said that you will receive a portion of the rewards for the discovery of the painting." Upon hearing this, Isaac's mood became brighter. Nothing sounded better than getting more money, after all. Even if he had become a crime lord with multiple assets under him and is making more than an average person, he still couldn't help but be filled with joy when his pockets got an extra few more. Was this greed? Of course it was. Was he ashamed of it? Hell no. Isaac might be a lot of things, but he wouldn't shy away from greed. Smiling cheerfully, he nodded at Nouvelette's words. How considerate of her. Oh, and you too, of course. Furina, who was beside him, on the other hand, scowled as she narrowed her eyes at him. Is money the only thing up there in that thick skull of yours? He blinked. Yes. She rolled her eyes. Oh really? Then I take it that you have no room for me up there, your dear God and employer. He then replied quickly. Well. It's not like that. Hearing this, she smiled sharply at him. Humph. It better be. Watching the two of them banter, Nouvelette took a moment to observe them in silence, as if trying to learn from their interaction. Then, without the two noticing, the impartial supreme judge of Fontaine raised his hand and looked at it with his sharp eyes. For a moment, it was as if the Ihudex was pondering something grander than his work, something more personal, it seems. A few moments later, however, he snapped out of the illusion he had conjured up in his elusive mind. With a shake of his head, he looked at Furina and Isaac before opening his mouth and speaking. If there's nothing more, then may I suggest we return. It was evident that the Ihudex wishes to return to his beloved office, from what Isaac sees. Nouvelette then continued, since you have accomplished your goal here, there should be no more hold-ups, right? Lady Furina. Indeed. She replied with a satisfied expression. Not only had we found my beloved portrait, but I also convinced my dear assistant to do another task for me. How come I have no idea about it, though? Isaac thought with worry as he felt an ominous feeling from Furina's words. But in the end, he remained composed outside. Sensing Isaac's confusion, Furina then looked back to him and flashed a cunning smirk as if she was planning something devious. Isaac had seen a lot of people's expressions, and very few have showed him that kind of smile. Perhaps the only close to doing it was Linny, but even then, it wasn't intentional. This one was pure deviousness. This can't be good. Isaac's danger senses were going off. Trying to placate his mood, he nodded his head. He then looked at Nouvelette and shortly added after Furina's words. I mean, what can I even do when it's my lady's request? He continued with a wry smile, half joking. For her, I'd even go to the stars and the abyss. Nouvelette nodded his head. I must admit that your loyalty is a trait that should be admired by many. Nouvelette said with the same impartial voice of his. Furina, on the other hand, smiled brightly after hearing Isaac's words. With a cheerful voice and a hidden scheme mixed in, she spoke while looking at Nouvelette. Finally starting to see my assistant's wondrous traits, are we? Well, I'll just let you know now that he's occupied for the time being, so no laying any hand on him. Nouvelette shook his head. Although it never appeared, Isaac could have sworn that the impartial Chief Justice displayed a sort of hidden scowl. There is no need. You can keep him to yourself. I have no plans of hiring anyone, for the foreseeable future. Somewhat satisfied with the Ihudex's answer, Furina nodded her head. Shortly after, she intertwined her arm with Isaac and dragged him with her. If there's nothing more, then me and my assistant will be going now. We still have a lot to do, after all. She then looked up at Isaac, her eyes brimming with excitement of what she was planning. Let's go, my dear assistant. Isaac, who was being dragged away, had enough strength to break away from her but decided to just let her do her thing. Looking back at Nouvelette, Isaac conjured a wry smile, showing that he too shared the Ihudex's problem. Isaac then raised his hand and waved at him while running with Furina to the hills. Sorry for this abruptness, Monsieur Nouvelette. It was nice meeting you. With those words, Isaac turned his attention back to Furina and ran with her. To the Ihudex, their destination was unknown, and, for the time being, he did not want to know. Seeing the two leave, Nouvelette became silent for a few moments before releasing a deep sigh. Holding his cane, he depended on it for a moment. Lady Furina. I hope your judgment is right. Otherwise. He shook his head. The Chief Justice ought to have more faith in the God of Justice, but the latter was making it difficult for the former. Turning his head, he looked back to the painting resting below the massive tree situated in the middle of the lake. Nouvelette lingered for a few moments as he stared at it, observing the painting which had disappeared under their noses not too long ago with interest. Just then, Neuvillette noticed something at the bottom of the painting. Curious, he got closer and observed it closer. That is, situated near the edge of the painting, a dark stain was present. It blended well with the oil painting, and, with the mix of water from the rain, it produced a unique blemish. Oil, water, and something else produced such a stain. From its hue, Neuvillette initially suspected it to be something akin to blood, but he needed more information to verify his suspicion. The stain had already dried, but Neuvillette sensed that it had been put there not too long ago. Curious, the Ihudex extended his hand to observe it further. With his elusive power related to water, the impartial Chief Justice was able to resonate with the stain pretty fast. In fact, it did not even pose any difficulty for him to determine what it truly was. It was indeed blood. And indeed, it was from a human. However, what Neuvillette sensed more left him perturbed. With his affiliation with water, he was able to notice the lingering influences on the blood. Such vile contempt! He mumbled to himself while analyzing the blood. Hidden in the blood was an endless amount of fear and hatred. It was as if the person the blood came from had suffered an inhumane amount's torture. What surprised Neuvillette more, however, was that he could still trace the blood's origins back. And the source was still inside the court of Fontaine. Gazing up at the painting before looking back at the dried blood at the edge of it, Neuvillette lingered for a few moments before his eyes narrowed. He then mumbled a few words to himself. An invitation, is it? He doesn't even need to guess who was inviting him. Clown! He added as he stared off at the direction of the court of Fontaine. A moment of silence soon enveloped the Chief Justice for a few moments as he deeply contemplated the matter. As for the person who had invited him, he was currently being dragged away against his will. It was almost comical. Such is the perverseness of fate. Chapter 87, I'm not a doll. Knock. Mr. Isaac? Are you there? Knocking at the café's doors, Freminot warily looked around as his gaze lingered on the locked door that separates him from the comfortable café. It was currently the next morning, and the newspapers contained nothing but the latest discovery of the missing painting of Focalors. Freminot would have usually just ignored it if not for the fact that one of the major contributors of it was Isaac. When he found out about it, he immediately left to congratulate him. But to the young diver's dismay, the café was still closed. It left him in an uncomfortable mood. This can't be right. Freminot mumbled under his breath as his gaze lingered. It's not Sunday yet and it's well past the opening hours. Mr. Isaac? Where are you? As Isaac's pupil, Freminot had always come by and learned from the former without missing a single day. The intricate brewing technique as well as the subtle but beautiful art of mixture had somehow stirred something deep inside the young diver's character, inevitably making him a pupil to which Isaac passes his techniques to. As such, the thought of missing a day of lesson with his mentor slightly troubled him. It was as though he was being separated from his parent, which was rather odd due to his loyalty to the Knave. Perhaps, deep in the young diver's heart, he sensed a similar dependable figure of the Knave in Isaac. It was far from being a responsible parent, but more of a pillar of support. After all, the thought of Isaac acting like a good parent never really crossed his mind. Rather, he could clearly paint a scene of Isaac struggling to even properly handle a toddler, and resorting to underhanded tactics. Unironically, Isaac wouldn't even doubt him if Freminot were to speak that idea out loud. He could see himself doing it too. Just then, while Freminot was in the middle of his stupor, a voice reached his ears, slightly startling him. Is this the place? Immediately turning around, Freminot looked at the source of the voice. Who it was, however, gave him a bit of shock that he almost didn't manage to contain. His gaze landed on the person's figure and deeply observed their figure. Pale skin, violet eyes fading to pink, and long violet hair with the tips all swept upwards. And a musket that hung on her left shoulder. Freminot could never mistake someone like that for anyone else even if he wanted to. After all, it was the very same person that the spies of the heart were actively avoiding. Noticing the young diver's curious gaze, the person looked at him with a similar gaze and asked sincerely, "Excuse me, this is the café run by Isaac Alder, right?" After a while, however, she immediately recognized the young man standing in front of her. Hold on. Freminot? That's you, right? The star diver. Upon hearing his name uttered by her, Freminot forced a calm demeanor taught to him by Isaac and nodded his head, quickly responding to her question. Why yes. That's me, Miss Chevrieuse. This lady was none other than the captain of the Maison Gardiennage Special Security and Surveillance Patrol. Using unorthodox yet conventional methods, she had garnered a bit of a reputation for her high efficiency in capturing criminals. For Freminot, who was associated with an espionage orphanage, he and his siblings naturally know her. After all, they had been avoiding her after every operation. Chevrieuse nodded her head. Ah, I was right. Recognizing a star diver has never been easier. Her claims weren't groundless. Even though Freminot prefers to be reclusive and avoids the limelight frequently, his capabilities weren't hidden completely. The young diver, too, had earned a bit of fame from his outstanding diving capabilities among his peers. Though, if Freminot was a tad bit more paranoid, he would have thought that she recognized him as a suspicious individual. Fortunately, he has an alibi for his presence here today. Mustering a bit of courage to speak, he opened his mouth. What brings you here, Miss Chevrieuse? Do you need something from Mr. Isaac? Aware of Isaac and the Knave's connection, he made sure to ask the question as mundanely as possible. He doesn't know if Isaac was part of something far more sinister to catch the Knave's attention, but he was determined to protect his mentor. This stems from the fact that he was both a mentor figure and an acquaintance of his father. Chevrieuse gazed at the young diver and nodded. That's right. I wanted to discuss something with him and express the Special Security's gratitude. I already know Navia and have talked to her first, and now it's his turn. However, it seems that I've come at a bad time. She shook her head lightly before continuing, still looking at Freminot. You're waiting for him, aren't you? I'm sorry, but I don't think I'd be able to stay for a bit longer. Can you give Mr. Isaac my regards? It would be much appreciated. Freminot nodded his head, slightly relieved that the officer wouldn't be lingering further. Yes. I'd make sure to send him your regards, Miss Chevrieuse. That is, if he opens today. She smiled softly at his answer. Thank you. Well then, farewell. With that said, Chevrieuse waved him goodbye before turning around and leaving, returning to her duty as a captain. Watching her leave, Freminot lingered for a bit before turning around and looking at the closed doors of the café. It was still there, closed and never changing. There were no sights of Isaac anywhere. At some point, Freminot even entertained the idea of breaking in. But he restrained himself and convinced himself that Isaac would be quite upset if he did such a thing. As such, he waited outside for nearly half an hour. Still, there were no signs of Isaac ever opening the doors. Maybe he really isn't gonna open today. Faced with this thought, a defeated sigh escaped his mouth. Reluctantly looking at the café one last time, Freminot lingered for a bit more longer before finally leaving. It was obvious that Isaac was absent today, which was a rare occurrence. As the deterred young man walked the streets of Fontaine, he couldn't help but contemplate in his mind what he should do for the time being. There really aren't any new mission issues out by Father. She had just been training us as if preparing for something. As for Linny and Lynette, ever since they were granted free rein by the Archon with their Magic Pockets project, coupled with Isaac's financial support, they've been quite busy. He then stopped and looked at the distant blue skies of the Nation of Waters, pondering his purpose for the day. Maybe I should just go home and brew coffee. The young man was about to entertain this idea, when suddenly, a figure suddenly dashed in the distance and quickly turned a corner to where Freminot was, determined to get away from something. Hey! Freminot, who saw the figure rapidly approaching him, froze as he quickly recognized who it was. That lean figure, coupled with that memorable brown hair. He wouldn't mistake it for anyone even if he wanted to. It was Isaac. And he was running while wearing a suit. Confirming who it was, Freminot shouted, with curiosity and a bit of longing present in his voice. Mr. Isaac! Where have you been all this time? Isaac, who was running with all his might, heard someone call for him and looked at the young man. Hey! Oh, Freminot! Recognizing who it was, Isaac quickly turned around as if looking out for someone before changing his direction towards the young man at full speed. With his physical fitness, it wasn't hard to dash quickly. In less than a few moments, the student and mentor reunited, albeit in an alleyway. Huffing, Isaac looked out and made sure he wasn't caught. Huff! I should be safe here. For the time being, at least. Looking at his mentor, Freminot's eyes trembled as many thoughts flashed through his mind, trying to piece together what was happening from the clues present currently. A loose suit with a lingering fragrant scent, an exhausted stature, and a cautious expression only resulted in Freminute forming a dangerous thought. When he formed that thought, a foreign feeling emerged from the young man's mind. It was a feeling he had seemingly long lost. Mr. Isaac. Are you being followed? He recognized those sharp and alert eyes. It was the very same eyes he had seen in his siblings before when doing undercover missions. Those stark, keen eyes which seemed to look like a hawk were nothing new to him. Hearing the young man's words, Isaac lingered for a bit before smiling wryly. Ah, well. It's a complicated story. Freminute pursued the matter. Do you need any help then? I'm sure I can be of help. Isaac shook his head lightly. There's no need. There had just been a mild misunderstanding. That's all. Misunderstanding. Freminute was just about to ask this question when he suddenly saw Isaac's expression change. Oh. Isaac said with a cautious expression. He then looked at the young man. Come on, let's not get caught. With that said, Isaac grabbed Freminute by the hand and backed to a corner in the shadows. With a reluctant hesitation, Isaac paused for a moment before grimacing. Shortly after Isaac's grimace emerged, it was as if the darkness around them thickened. The dark became darker and the light became lighter. It was quite surreal. But it was also thanks to this that they managed to escape the eyes of the pursuers. Not too far away, the two hidden men heard the voice of women. Keep looking, Chevreuse. He couldn't have gotten away. A stern voice echoed throughout the alleyway. Followed by it was the voice Freminute was familiar with. Why are you even so bent on capturing Isaac, Kyrie? Did he do something to you? The woman named Kyrie shook her head and quickly responded. No, not me entirely. Her too. Then, not far away, the familiar visage of the Archon of Fontaine appeared. Similar to Isaac, she was wearing a dress unfit for the current situation. If the two were put together, one can't help but suspect that they were attending a classical ball, or perhaps a ceremony of sorts? Whatever it was, it made the two of them look stunningly gorgeous, as if they were about to be the center stage of it all. Furina, who had an irritated expression, looked at the other two women and spoke candidly. No matter what, you have to capture him, my dear captain. He still owes me his presence for our important ball, and the two of us need to be of perfect outfits. Kyrie then added after Furina. Also, he dashed out while I was dressing him, and, on the way, bumped to Emily, who came to visit me. The result was her new perfume splashing onto him. That should add more reasons to the urgency of your help, yes. Chevreuse didn't know what to say for a moment before coming up with a response. I guess so. Well, since it's a request from Lady Furina and you, I guess I'll put in more work. I'll count on you, Chevreuse. As the three women spoke, not far away from them, the hidden Isaac shuddered as he heard them talk about what they'd do once they found him. Freminute, on the other hand, remained silent and merely grabbed onto Isaac's arm as if trying to comfort him. Should we hide somewhere else, Mr. Isaac? Isaac smiled wryly. Yeah, I think we should. God knows what would happen to me if Furina gets her hands on me again. After saying this, he looked down on his suit and remembered where Furina had dragged him to this morning. From salons to various boutiques, he was dragged everywhere for a supposed ball they would attend. Along the way, Furina made Isaac put on a variety of things. Some were pleasant while some were suspiciously thought-provoking. He then shuddered as he whispered something under his breath. I don't want to be a doll again. It was going to be a long day. Chapter 88, I'm cooked. Normally, Isaac would have slithered his way out of Furina's scheme. However, today, her plan had left him with no choice but to run for his dear life, for if there was anything any man ever feared, it was accompanying a woman to shopping. Some might even say it was the bane of all men. As for Isaac, it was no different. The moment he was dragged out of his café by Furina, he didn't even manage to utter a word of complaint. He was just dragged away. He could have refused and stopped her, however, he had a deep gut feeling that if he did so, there would be dire consequences. As such, here he is now, wearing a barely passable disguise with Freminute as they both walked under broad daylight. Isaac, who was wearing a half-top hat and a pair of tinted glasses, looked at Freminute beside him and whispered. You know, you didn't have to do this, you know? I know how busy you are sometimes helping your siblings. Freminute shook his head in response. No, it's fine, Mr. Isaac. I had nothing else to do today anyway, so I'm happy to help. Yet? What a nice kid. Isaac smiled. As they walked, Freminot couldn't help but be curious and asked him a question. By the way, how did you even get into that situation, Mr. Isaac? It seemed like Lady Furina was really hunting you down. Despite the young man's upbringing and side profession, his tone was surprisingly innocent. Isaac noticed this and couldn't help but be amused. He was then reminded that, even though the child with him was a trained professional spy, he was also but a child that had yet to take on the truly mundane side of the mature world. As such, aside from disposing of unwanted bodies, he wasn't quite aware of the other bodies. Isaac lightly chuckled. It was just a matter of disagreement. I felt like I was gonna sink into something I'd regret, as such, I ran away. I'm sure you'll encounter this kind of situation in the future. He added. Isaac was sincere with his words. The young diver might not know it, but he had garnered quite a bit of attention in the cafe with his soft demeanor and looks. Isaac even managed to get a glimpse of a few young female customers occasionally eyeing the young man. If Freminot wasn't so introverted, then perhaps he would have been far more popular with other people. Isaac even wondered if he could influence the child in that direction. But he feared that by doing so, he'd invoke the wrath of not only the other two siblings, but also their father. As such, he quickly disposed of such a notion, never daring to think of it again. It was enough for one pretentious scamp to work in the cafe. There was no need for another one. Should I say it's fortunate that he's soft-spoken? Isaac entertained the idea before discarding it shortly after. Freminot looked at him, the soft innocence glistening in his eyes. I don't think that will come any time soon though. For now, I'm just content with helping out my siblings and father. As well as you. Isaac lingered for a moment before replying. That's great. How dependable of you. As expected of my pupil. Freminot, upon hearing him, paused for a moment giving a response. There's no need to inflate your ego. Surprised by his reply, Isaac was slightly startled. A bit blunt, but true nonetheless. Where'd you learn that? Freminot quickly replied. I learned from that Anajaman woman that frequents the cafe. She knows a lot of things and sometimes teaches me. Of course. I should have known. Isaac scowled. Knowing that fox, she has definitely taught the young man. As the two walked though, Isaac couldn't help but notice the direction of which they were heading. He hesitated for a moment before asking the young man beside him with skepticism. Freminot, where exactly are we going? Isaac couldn't return to his cafe since he knew Furina would quickly find him there, as such, he decided to follow his pupil somewhere to hide. It's just that the place they were heading was. Freminot turned around and looked at Isaac. Don't worry. You'll be safe with us. Ah, I knew it. Isaac smiled wryly. I'm going to the House of the Heart, aren't I? In other words, Arlecchino's territory. There was a reason Isaac had avoided that location whenever he disguised himself as Gehrman at night. One was because the children there were good at investigations, and the other is because he might encounter Arlecchino. Not that it matters since she already knows his other identity though. But still. It would be rather awkward so Isaac actively avoided them. But now. Looking at the familiar hotel that the Hearth is currently staying at, an ominous feeling rose up from Isaac's chest. Oh boy. He just hopes he and Arlecchino were still on good terms. Meanwhile, somewhere in Floversendra, in a secluded location where barely anyone could ever notice, two figures can be seen conversing. Report. Yes, father. The woman, with the sharp silver hair and crimson-crossed eyes, emanated a sense of cold ruthlessness and dominance. Yet also a cold and calculating gaze. She looked at one of her children or spies and waited for a report. The organization responsible for the production of synth has well expanded over the past few weeks. Currently, many high-profile targets involved in the business have been forced to realign with the new rising organization. Merchants, nobles, and even public figures tied to the criminal rings all submitted to this new force. Those who defied were, later found hung upside down. As the spy reported, she handed a few photographs of various people that ranged from pictures of men meeting up in secret to men hanging upside down in the outskirts of the city with life drained out of their eyes. Arlecchino looked at them one by one with her usual cold indifference, but this time, a frown appeared on her face. It seems like our clown has been busy. Don't you agree? The spy nodded. Yes, father. Revolts and gang wars have been happening frequently ever since he appeared, but they were all suppressed by him alone with nothing but his cold brutality and revolver. Some are even starting to spread urban legends about him. She then questioned. What's the name of this organization? Yes, it took a while, but I've now confirmed it. The spy responded. They seem to be calling resembles the Syndicate. Arlecchino listened as her eyes borrowed, finding herself drifting off to a thought while simultaneously listening to her child. How utterly risible! Indeed, ever since Isaac had appeared, the chaotic undercurrents of Fontaine have only grown more turbulent. It was as if a rock had fallen into a lake, causing ripples to spread out. For years, the House of the Hearth had discreetly operated in the shadows of Fontaine, treating it as their headquarters. Sometimes, they'd do missions in the nation itself, while in other times, they'd infiltrate another nation for an espionage mission. Suffice to say, Arlecchino had a decent knowledge of every figure in Fontaine that upholds the delicate balance of the nation. Be it someone corrupt or an absolute holder of justice, they are all the same in her eyes, gears that keep everything running. So imagine her utter disbelief when the intricately designed machine of gears that she watches over was suddenly pulled out and rearranged by another person by pure force. This new force that seemingly spawned out of nowhere had, in a short amount of time, built itself as a new overlord in Fontaine's darkness. Brazenly storming in. It felt disrespectful to her, to say the least. But she isn't petty enough to start a meaningless feud. Although Isaac has indeed made things difficult for her, she still managed to find a decent silver lining in all of it. Indeed, she could have done the same thing as he did. After all, she didn't lack any power and doubted that she was any weaker than Isaac. But her principles and the nature of the hearth had prevented her from doing so. So when someone else has arrived and had put a leash over everything, it became a favorable opportunity for her to also put her leash on him. Arlecchino released a soft hum before speaking. That's enough. I'll now return to the hearth. Continue observing this new organization and report any new major movements immediately. Yes, father. With that said, the two parted ways, each going their own way and walking in the shadows. To them, the darkness was a familiar friend which could both serve as a shield and an accomplice, making it useful for traversal and stalking. Arlecchino then left Floversendra and walked on the streets of Fontaine. As the director of the House of the Hearth walked under broad daylight, she had mostly kept to herself and didn't make eye contact. She rarely appeared in public, as such, some people who saw her became a bit skeptical to approach her menacing figure. But she did not mind. So long as they steered out of her way, then there would be nothing more than that. Soon, Arlecchino saw the familiar hotel where her children were staying at. There, the warm embrace of the fireplace sheltered them from the cold reality outside, thus giving them a safe roof. And it wouldn't have been possible if not for their father. Arlecchino approached and gently opened the door. She expected to see her children to either be playing or preparing for their next mission. That was the common sight she always sees, after all. But this time, something else was happening inside the lounge of the hotel. Now watch this, everybody. I'll make this dagger disappear in front of your very eyes. She recognized that voice. For it was none other than the new troublemaker she has just been thinking of earlier. What followed next were the voice of her children. What? That can't be possible. Yet. Unless you're Linny or Lynette, I doubt you could pull something like that with all of us watching. I think Mr. Isaac can do it. He even swallowed a bullet earlier and made it appear in his ear. But how would he make a dagger disappear with no other props? Isaac smiled as he listened to their voices. Then, as he held the dagger with one hand, another hand slowly descended on it. As it descended, the dagger slowly disappeared from their view. Soon, the dagger was gone. Ta-da! Upon seeing the magic trick, both the children and the young adults of the hearth couldn't help but be impressed. It was a shame that Linny and Lynette weren't here to witness it. Whoa! That's amazing! How'd you do that? Now swallow the dagger. Maybe sometime, kid. Isaac replied with a wry smile. Of course, he was only able to do this trick with the help of the inventory function of the system. It was a crude trick, but it works. Suddenly, while Isaac was performing, he suddenly felt the icy cold gaze of the newly arrived person. Turning around, he looked at the door and saw the familiar indifferent and cold depression of Arlecchino, one that radiates deadly allure and ruthlessness. Upon seeing her, Isaac slightly tensed up. He conjured up a smile then greeted her. Oh, hello? Good morning. There was a momentary silence between them before she replied. Would you mind following me upstairs, Mr. Isaac? I wish to discuss something with you. She didn't clarify what exactly she wanted to talk about, and that made Isaac both suspicious and nervous. Hesitant, he convinced himself that she wouldn't do anything to him and lingered for a while before reluctantly nodding. Oh. Okay. If you say so. But I won't reveal any magician's secret though. She didn't reply. Ah. I'm cooked. He had a feeling that this was going to be much more dangerous than what Furina had planned for him today. I made a mistake. I want to go back to my Archon. As they say, regret comes last. Chapter 89, Unique Scent. I'm actually shocked at how good Isaac is at hiding. Furina said as she and the other two women took a break to eat lunch. It was obvious that the cunning man was never gonna show up again anytime soon, as such, all three of them decided to stop chasing after him. For the time being. Picking up a deep-fried onion ring, Chevrieuse nodded her head. I've known a fair bit of criminals who are good at running away, but this Isaac. He might very well be the clown if he's this good. Furina smiled upon hearing this. I won't even be surprised if it's actually him. Her tone without a doubt carried lightheartedness and is just trying to entertain Chevrieus's words, however, hidden in them was a hint of amusement. Kyrie, who was eating macarons, then joined in their conversation. I've dealt with a few clients like those myself. Still, it's rare to find someone who's not only quick to his feet, but also his mind. The fashion designer shared her own experience regarding characters similar to Isaac. Well, with her controversial character, it was hard to not believe her. Furina then turned to the fashion designer. Well, that's enough of that. I'll find him soon enough. Regarding the outfits. What do you think? Would you be able to make them soon? Kyrie took her time chewing on her macarons before replying succinctly. To be honest, I've had designs specifically for you already at my disposal for times like this. You're a frequent client, Lady Furina, as such, I've gotten a grasp of your preferred style. But that Isaac. How do I put this? He seems like an empty mannequin. Everything suits him, which makes it hard to pick which suits him the best. Furina narrowed her eyes as she shot an eyebrow. Is that a compliment? Kyrie shook her head as she grimaced. Hardly. Furina lingered for a moment, seriously contemplating the fashion designer's words. She even waited a moment to see if she was joking, but she didn't. The renowned unconventional fashion designer was seriously having trouble picking the right clothes for someone who fits any clothes he's in. That. I would have never thought that someone would come across such a dilemma. However. Now that I think about it. Furina then delved back into her memories and recalled all the outfits Isaac had worn. In retrospect, Kyrie was right. Furina had never once seen that sly bartender once appear in clothes that didn't suit him. Be it in his cafe, running an errand, or even doing mundane things, Isaac has always appeared polished with the appropriate clothes. Unknowingly, Furina had solved one of the reasons why Isaac was good at his disguises. He was just too much of a blank canvas. Then doesn't that work well for both of us? She added to her thoughts. Similar to him, she too always wore clothes appropriate for any occasion. As the biggest star of Fontaine, she always needed to appear confident and flamboyant both in the eyes of the people and to herself. Her intricate dresses, and other outfits, were always of top quality. Additionally, Furina, too, never once appeared in mundane clothes even when she was by herself. Not to mention her exquisite charm and flamboyant personality, she suited any kind of outfit she wore, able to blend in perfectly to any situation. If both appeared together in public in pristine outfits, she wouldn't even doubt it if people suspected them to be starring in some kind of film or acting in a theater. After pondering for a while, Furina curled up a smile. Well, since he isn't so cooperative, just pick him a suit that, well, complements with what I would wear. That won't be much of a problem, yes. Kyrie lingered for a moment before nodding. It's hardly a challenge. Still, I think it would be interesting. Chevrieuse shot an eyebrow when she heard her words. Kyrie finding something interesting. Not often you'd hear such a thing. Kyrie scowled at her friend. To be honest, I wouldn't even consider doing such a tedious task if it wasn't Lady Furina. Nonetheless, I'll stay true to my words. They should be ready well before the event starts, Lady Furina. After listening to her friend, Chevrieuse lingered for a moment before finishing her onion ring. Forgive me for asking, but what event would you even be attending to go this far, Lady Furina? I get that you're friends with that Isaac and all, but he's still just a barista, right? As far as the public was informed, Isaac's Café is a high-class gathering place where only the rich or well-off people can enter. Merchants, influential figures, and even government officials frequent his café, thus making it seem regal. As such, it wouldn't come much of a surprise when even the Archon of the nation visits it frequently. Beyond this, they know nothing else about the barista and the Archon's clandestine relationship. Furina heard her question and nodded her head. She had expected this question and had an answer prepared for it in advance. Well, you must have heard about this year's film festival, yes? It was a resounding success. This year had more participants than last year, and many new talents emerged. As such, with the end of the festival approaching, the organizers are holding a ball that invites everyone that participated, including all personnel. Needless to say, the spotlight for this ball would be to our team that won. That's why Isaac, the lead actor, and me, the director, needs to look our best. That goes the same for the other casts. Chevreuil's digested everything Furina said and lightly nodded her head. I see. Thank you for the information. It seems like the Maison Gardiennage is just gonna send the guards, though. I'll make sure to send some of my members for extra measures. Furina smiled. Thank you, Captain Chevreuil. Kyrie then scowled as she pointed at Chevreuil's hand. Chevreuil. The grease is getting on your uniform. Oh sorry. Noticing this, Chevreuil cleaned her uniform. As the three women talked amongst themselves, the thought of capturing Isaac slowly drifted away from their minds. And to be honest, they can't be blamed for it if he didn't want to be found, then so be it. Well, that was supposed to be how it would be if not for the fact that another person was approaching them. Why are you all? Oh. Lady Furina. You're here too. The three women shifted their eyes and looked at the source of the voice and saw a familiar person. Pale white skin, short blonde hair that faded to pink, and glasses that hung on her face. Kyrie was the first to talk to her. Ah, Emily. You're here. Chevreuil then followed. We're just taking a break. I'll go back to tracking once we're finished. Lastly, Furina nodded at Chevreuil's words. A proper meal is always required before and after every activity, after all. Emily lingered for a moment as she observed the three women. She could imagine Chevreuil and Kyrie teaming up together, but it was rare for their Archon to join in something like tracking down a person. Nudging her glasses, she paused for a moment before speaking. Well, I didn't want to disturb your meal, but I've found a way to find that rude person who bumped into me. The incident earlier this morning was still fresh in Emily's mind. She was just supposed to deliver a new pack of perfumes to Kyrie, when suddenly, a rude man dashed out of the door and bumped into her, causing one of the perfumes to fall and break. She could have forgiven him, but he only apologized for a second before running away once more. It didn't feel sincere. That was unforgivable. Furina's face brightened upon hearing Emily's words. Really? That's great. But how? Emily explained. Well, the perfumes I was about to deliver today were all new. Their scent, I mean. This new scent gives off a rich wooden oud scent. It has a rich and smoky aroma that is suited for the mature audience and complements evenings. And they just happened to cling on that man when one of them broke. As Furina listened to the perfumer's explanation, her face couldn't help but change as more and more details of the perfume are mentioned. Why does that sound like? Furina then pushed these thoughts aside for a while and spoke. I'm sorry, but how would this help? It sounds like a good perfume, but how would we be able to find Isaac with this information? Emily nudged her glasses. Well, to tell the truth, this is the first batch of new perfumes I made this month. Meaning? Seeing how she stopped her sentence there, Chevreuil decided to finish it for her. Meaning we can find Isaac if we ask around if anyone has smelled that unique smoky scent, yes? Emily nodded. Yes, that's right. Indeed, it seemed like a good plan. Perfumes made by Emily were regarded as good quality in Fontaine, and very few have the same quality as her products, making them easily distinguishable. With her with them, it wouldn't be too hard to find the man who ran away. Furina smiled. That's great. But Emily, I have a question. That perfume of yours. If you were to describe it in one word, what would its scent be? Something had been present in Furina's mind for a while now, and she needed the answer. She first thought of this earlier when Emily explained her perfume. Kyrie looked at Furina for a bit and decided to ask with a raised eyebrow. You don't know? Furina felt like she was onto something. What do you mean? Emily, on the other hand, looked at her archon and lingered for a while before nudging her glasses. Well, if I can describe this scent. I say it's... She paused then continued. Seductive. Furina subtly scowled. Releasing a soft sigh, she mumbled something under her breath. Of course it is. The four women lingered for a bit in the restaurant before resuming their hunt for the runaway customer. They started from Kyrie's boutique and asked people if they smelled something akin to Emily's perfume. Fortunately for them, quite a few people picked up the scent and pointed them in a certain direction. However, Kyrie and Emily had to stay behind and attend the boutique, leaving only the Furina and Chevrillus on their quest. But it didn't take long for them to finally track down the location of where Isaac was possibly hiding. Chevrillus looked up at the hotel and spoke. That's it, hey. Furina nodded. Indeed. That's where our clues are pointing at. That's where that rude man is. They had been running all over Fontaine for a while now just to find Isaac. Now that they found him, Furina was itching to teach her man a lesson. Wait, man? Furina shook her head lightly, as if taking off certain thoughts from her mind. She then looked up at the hotel and said with a determined expression. Well then. Let's go. Tud. However, before they could step another foot, a window from the hotel suddenly opened and a figure jumped out of it acting without a care for the world free bird style. The floor the body fell from wasn't that high, but it would have surely injured the person a bit. Thud. The body then fell in front of the two women. There, on the hard ground floor, the body shuddered for a moment before lifting his head and meeting their eyes. Then, a wry smile appeared on his face. It was Isaac. Good day, innit? A lot of explanation was needed. Chapter 90, Father, it's a joke. A while before Furina's arrival, Isaac followed Arlecchino upstairs to discuss something with her. As the sly barista followed behind her, he was able to see the rest of the House of the Hearth, as well as the passing members of it. Some were in their adolescence, some in their early adulthood, and a few children. Suffice to say, it was truly a diverse orphanage. If Isaac hadn't known better, then he might have seriously thought that this was just another normal orphanage. Looking at each and every child of the hearth, Isaac inwardly sighed as he pondered their roles given by their father. Should one say it's a blessing or a curse to be taken in by her? He wasn't trying to question her methods, and just instead viewed it from an outsider's perspective. He was aware of the hearth's true purpose, its methods, as well as how valuable it is to the Fatui. After all, they were the one responsible for gathering information across the 7 nations, with a vast network of sleeper agents awaiting their father's orders. Remembering certain characters from the original storyline, Isaac couldn't help but wonder about the children in the hearth and their well-being. However, he soon brushed those thoughts off. Well, if the one raising them is the 4th strongest harbinger, then I can't really blame them. Though, that would probably come with a price of spilling blood. But, again, Isaac wasn't questioning their ways, he was just contemplating. As if reading his thoughts, Arlecchino turned around and looked at the barista behind her. Her infernal crimson-crossed eyes observed him in silence for a few moments, as if surveying him. Man! Is her intuition that strong? Faced with her stare, Isaac curled up a small smile and nodded at her. She lingered for a few moments before shifting her gaze back and proceeding with her walk. It was for a brief moment, but Isaac could have sworn he saw her eyes gleam, and whatever kind of thought invoked that gleam was surely not simple. Their walk continued in silence, and soon, they reached a certain room at the upper floor of the hotel. From the way the door of the room was decorated minimally, it was obvious that it was not something easily approached by the children. Arlecchino opened the door slightly, and the first thing Isaac saw was a fairly normal office room. The door creaks open wider, revealing more of the dimly lit room bathed in the amber glow of the sun outside peering through tinted blinders. That is unexpected. Feels like I just entered an early 20th century investigator's room or something. He wasn't even kidding. It was something he didn't expect from someone like Arlecchino. But then again, he didn't truly know her that well, so he can't really say much. He looked a bit more, finding the room interesting. With a hint of interest in his eyes, he thought with envy. Maybe I can copy this for my own room. Seems fun and practical. The air smells faintly of old leather and ink. The space is minimal, almost plain, with no clutter save for the meticulous stacks of paper lined up on a wooden desk in the center. Shelves on the walls hold only the essentials books, folders, and a few neatly labeled files. Arlecchino stepped in first, her heels making soft clicks against the worn hardwood floor. Her eyes flicked briefly to the desk, reassured by the familiar order of things. She moves with purpose, her presence quietly commanding, as though this room is an extension of herself. She owns this space, and every piece of it is in its rightful place except for the growing stack of papers that hint at more questions than answers. Her voice then reached Isaac's ears, carrying a sense of authority that asks for no compromise. "Sit down." "Yes, ma'am." Isaac followed her figure and did as she told and sat down on one of the chairs, trying not to get under her skin. However, as he did so, his couldn't help but gaze around with curiosity. He looked at her near desk and lingered over the papers present, noticing cryptic marks in the margins and scattered references to cases long forgotten. His hand hovered over one of the piles but didn't touch it, respecting the precision she's imposed on the chaos. "It seems like everyone is interested in this case," he murmured, half impressed, half amused but still maintained his feeble look. It was the serial disappearances case. A long-running case that has plagued Fontaine for the past decade. "You know, this is actually..." Trying to strike up a conversation, Isaac spoke with interest as his gaze shifted to Arlecchino. However, his voice trailed off when he saw what she was doing. Over at the corner, Arlecchino took off her grayish-white overcoat and hung it on a wooden coat rack, leaving only her fitted grey shirt. Of course, this also allowed Isaac to see her blackened arms that resemble burnt wood that laid bare open in his eyes. She then caught his gaze and narrowed her eyes without speaking a word. For a moment, Isaac felt as if he was suffocating, so he quickly stopped ogling at her. Not that he was looking at her in a lecherous manner, goodness no. Arlecchino walked over behind her desk and sat down and soon looked at Isaac. Likewise, he looked back at her. Then, after a moment of silence, her lips parted. "First of all, thank you for your time, Mr. Isaac. But this is where the formality ends. I want to get straight to the point." She sure is succinct about this. He thought before clearing his throat and speaking. "Of course. What would you like to discuss?" Her eyes narrowed down on him while maintaining her stern cold expression. "Why are you here and what do you want? I believe we have nothing else to discuss after our deal in your café, am I right?" Isaac smiled. "Well, to tell the truth, I was invited here by one of your children. I won't get too much into the details, but I just needed a place to hide and one of your children just happened to find me and suggested I stay here for a while." She then lingered for a while and thought for a moment, trying to figure out which child it was. However, before she made any drastic decisions, Isaac quickly intervened. "Oh, and, if you could, please don't blame the child that invited me." He was just trying to help out his struggling mentor. Isaac sensed that Arlecchino might give Freminate some sort of punishment for inviting outside parties in the House of the Hearth. In their clandestine organization, such an act was equivalent to openly saying that they were spies. As such, this was utterly prohibited. But since Freminate was aware of Isaac and Arlecchino's acquaintance, he must have speculated that the former was allowed to visit. Now, obviously, Isaac doesn't want anything bad to happen to his dear pupil, as such, he quickly tried to negotiate with Arlecchino. She lingered for a bit and said with an amused tone. "How bold of you, Mr. Isaac. To openly question the way I handle my organization. Tell me one food reason why I shouldn't take this as a sort of provocation." He grimaced, fully expecting that she'd say something similar to this. No, you got it all wrong. I'm not questioning you nor provoking you. I'm just negotiating, that's all." "And what would you use to negotiate with me?" she questioned. Isaac fell silent. Indeed, he currently doesn't have anything to barter with the father of the hearth. The best he could do is provide information, but even then, she might have already learned about them. Her network is far greater than his, after all. Seeing his reluctant and deterred expression, she lingered for a bit before smiling lightly. "You know, I do sometimes wonder how someone like you managed to get where you are right now." He smirked wryly. "Luck. And a lot of acting is all it took. A clown then," she added after him and continued speaking. "But we digress. Regarding the child that invited you, I'll make sure to give him an appropriate punishment. Good children should listen well." Hearing this, Isaac grimaced slightly. He was unable to stop her from punishing Furina in the end, and it made him a tad bit guilty. With her unconventional methods and standards, she would without a doubt issue a punishment that would remind Furina why listening to her would result in severe consequences. Worst case scenario is that he'll be excommunicated and get burned, as she refers to it. Other than her, only Isaac knew what that term truly meant when dealing with her children. Stay strong, my pupil. You'll get through this predicament, I'm sure of it. In the end, all Isaac could do is have faith in Furina and hope that Arlecchino won't push him to the edge too hard. Watching Isaac grimace, Arlecchino lingered for a bit and observed him with eyes looking like that of a hawk. Of course, she still maintained her cold and composed expression as she studied him. She thought for a moment and then spoke with a tone that was as if lightly mocking him. And what makes you so compassionate towards the children now? After all the preparations you've done for your so-called grand plan. Isaac's smile faded and he frowned when he heard this. She then smiled coldly, without any trace of amusement nor joy. Ah, dear, oh dear, what is it? Is it the blood? The guilt? Or the thought of executing this madness of a plan you've concocted for the sake of the nation? A tad bit of a hypocrite, aren't we? Isaac stopped and listened to her, his thoughts trailing off somewhere else. His expression remained the same, but his deep amber eyes became much deeper as they watched her. A pair of infernal crimson crossed eyes and a pair of deep amber eyes looked at each in silence. Hidden behind them are indescribable thoughts. Then, he opened his mouth and smiled bleakly at her. You could say that. Those three. I've grown closer to them recently and hope for nothing but the best for them. As such, I want this plan to succeed without shedding too much blood. She blinked. So I've heard. On one hand, you could be true with your emotions, but on the other hand, you could be feeling guilty. Isaac had shared his plan with her, and, indeed, she agreed to it. But even then, it was obvious that she still held doubts about his dubious plan that involved a lot of people, and 3 measly siblings from the hearth. A grand plan that would set things back to the appropriate course of events, help the hearth, and most importantly, ensure Furina's safety for the future. For such a grand plan, Isaac had strained his mind with stress, thinking about all the potential casualties that could arise from it. But, over time, he had concluded that it was necessary. Conjuring a light smile, Isaac cleared his mind and looked back at her with more clarity in his eyes. That is true, and I won't deny one bit. But you can't deny that, for measly just my mentality, Fontaine would grow stronger for the prophecy. He lingered for a bit before smiling softly. There are always things worth more protecting than oneself, after all. Upon hearing this, Arlecchino lingered and took in what he said. She contemplated deeply and, as she looked at him, couldn't help but gradually change her expression. Indeed, his plan was absolutely mad. However, despite its risks, its rewards were also worth it if everything goes smoothly. And, during their first meeting in the café, she agreed to it with one condition, a condition that, if the plan fails, would still benefit the hearth. She paused for a good bit then spoke. All right then, Mr. Clown. I will admit that you have a way with words. Thank you. He replied with a light nod. However, she quickly added more, trailing just behind her words. With a sinister look, she spoke. Now then. I believe you still owe a performance for my children. Isaac raised an eyebrow. What performance? Arlecchino leaned back, observing Isaac's changing expression with her cold look. Did you not promise one of my children earlier that you'd swallow a dagger for your magic trick? After saying this, Arlecchino reached out for her drawer and took out an intricately designed dagger from it. Afterwards, she slid it towards Isaac. Do it. I want to see your magic tricks, clown. Isaac stared at the dagger in front of him and looked at Arlecchino, who was observing his every move. Father. It was just a joke. A joke, he complained silently. However, could he pull off the inventory trick? Isaac hesitated, then reached out his hand and lingered above the blade, still reluctant to pick it up. Arlecchino watched him intently, observing how he would pull off such a magic trick in front of her. Then, all of a sudden, a noise suddenly interrupted the strange atmosphere between the two. Father! We're back! The voice was all the more familiar to Isaac. After all, it was none other than Linny. Arlecchino turned her head as she slightly scowled. Looking at her door, she stood up and walked towards it. The door opened and she saw her child, Linny. Seeing his father's expression, Lenny realized what he had done and looked apologetic. Oh, forgive me father. Was I interrupting something? Arlecchino lingered for a bit and shook her head. No, not at all. I was merely... She then shifted her gaze back to where Isaac was sitting and found, nothing. He was no longer there. Her gaze looked around a bit more and saw an anomaly in her room. The window was open. Seeing this, she fell silent as if deeply contemplating whether teaming up with such a man was a wise decision.
Thanks for listening.